Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, SANS 2022 Multicloud Survey, Exploring the World of Multicloud, sponsored by Cisco Umbrella, Corelight, Elastic, Infoblox, Lacework, Microsoft, Mitiga, Vectra, and Wiz. My name is Mary Lynn Gollier of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Brandon Evans, Certified Instructor and Author at SANS. Ken Hartman, Certified Instructor and Author at SANS. Bob Hansman, Senior Product Marketing Manager, Security at Infoblox. Todd Mornew, Principal Product Manager, Cloud Security at Corelight. Kedar Hiremith, Senior Product Marketing Manager, Cloud Security at Cisco. Ken St. Cyr, Solution Architect at Microsoft. Herman Opperman, Cybersecurity Architect at Microsoft. Jack Ports, Security Solution Architect at Microsoft. Scott Holt, Senior Solutions Architect at Elastic. Ofer Mayor, CTO and co-founder at Mitiga. And Ken Perkins, Senior Solutions Engineer at Wiz. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Oh, Ken, you're on mute.
All right, let's get it off to a good start. So hello, everybody. I'm Kenneth G. Hartman. I'm a certified SANS instructor, as Mary Lynn mentioned, and I teach the SEC 488 Cloud Security Essentials course. And I also teach SEC 510, which is what our co-author, Brandon, is the lead author for. So I'll let Brandon tell you a little bit about himself.
Yep. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you all today. I am, as Ken mentioned, a SANS certified instructor and author of SEC 510, Public Cloud Security, AWS, Azure, and GCP. I run my own consultancy, and prior to that, I worked for Zoom Video Communications, which is why I'm giving Ken grief for being on mute. I still do have a t-shirt that says "You're on mute" on it, and I wish I wore it today.
That's awesome. So first off, let's talk about our code of conduct. We really want our SANS events to be inclusive and respectful. So if ever there's anything that you feel is contrary to our aspiration, please email us, analyst@sans.org, and somebody will promptly get involved in that particular situation. We also want to talk about our Slack channels. So our URL to join this is sansurl.com analyst-research-content. So I'm being a little bit slow here so that you all can make a note of it, because we want to encourage as many people as are participating to join in our Slack discussion. We tend to have a lot of fun in the Slack channel. You might see some memes. You'll most definitely see a variety of helpful links and resources that are provided by Brandon and myself, as well as our various sponsors and presenters today. So our agenda, we're going to start off talking about the survey, the multi-cloud survey that Brandon and I have been working hard on, and several people behind the scenes, I should mention. We've been working on this for the past several months, and today is the culmination of our hard work, where we get to share the data with you publicly. So we'll have about a 25-minute discussion on all that, and then we're going to hand it over to our sponsors, who each have provided a representative to do a presentation for us on their take on the survey data that we provided them in advance, so that they could provide us some interesting content for. So let's start off with market trends. Brandon, I'll let you jump in here.
So as mentioned before, I'm the author of Sec 510 Public Cloud Security, AWS, Azure, and GCP. And the reason why SANS is a course dedicated to those big three cloud providers is because they are heavily used throughout the industry. And this can be seen in our survey data, where 86.4% of individuals are using Azure, 86.1% are using AWS, 80.8% is Google Cloud. What I was really surprised about, though, is that 58.3% of folks were using Oracle, 57.5% were using Alibaba, and 55.4% are using IBM. So we're actually seeing some growth in the little three cloud providers. I guess I'm going to coin that term here because, hey, these cloud providers are making a big impact, even though they are far behind the others. Now, this is not saying that the organizations are all in on these little three cloud providers. I'm positive that is not the case, but it is showing, in fact, that these cloud providers are being used for certain niche purposes. Now, we can actually see that in the workload spread shown here. We asked our respondents, what percentage of the workloads are you running in the following clouds? And we can see that while very few individuals are running 100% of their workloads in Alibaba, for example, there are significant amount of folks that are running 1 to 25% of their workloads there. And Ken, do you want to add something here?
Yeah, so when we first saw the data on this previous slide, we said, well, 50% of the respondents are using the top 6 providers. And then we were like, whoa, we better double check those facts. So then when we went back in and took a look at it, we wanted to see who had said that they were using each of the different cloud service providers. So when we took a second look, we saw that, yes, indeed, it was more than 50% of the respondents had indicated that they were using the top 6 providers. We also found that 30% said that they were using 7 providers. So that includes either private cloud or other. And that 13% said they were using all 8 of the choices that we provided them. I should also point out that the other category could include multiple different cloud providers like GoDaddy, Rackspace, Valtier, DigitalOcean, for example. So we found this to be very fascinating, that it truly is becoming more and more a multi-cloud world.
Now, why is it becoming a multi-cloud world? So there are a lot of reasons why one could go multi-cloud. Some folks want to go multi-cloud on purpose, and we're going to talk a little bit about why an individual or organization would want to do that and why they may not want to do that. But we also hypothesized, and we were proven out through this survey, that a lot of folks are adopting cloud providers as a result of mergers or acquisitions. Because when a company is looking to acquire another company, it's really not a big part of their decision criterion that, hey, the company we're trying to acquire, they use the same cloud provider as us. That's typically not something that comes up in those high-level meetings. That's an issue that they have to deal with after the fact. They either have to secure the platform that they acquired, or they have to consolidate the 2 platforms, but it's not really a decision maker. And we can see that borne out in this result here, where over 50% of the respondents indicated that they got a cloud account from AWS as a result of a merger or acquisition. And the same thing can be shown for Google, Azure, and there are even some instances in which acquisition of a company led to the adoption of Alibaba, IBM, and Oracle.
Yeah, so when you're presented with the prospect of having to support another cloud service provider, well, you really have that either the choice of learning how to support it or migrating away from that. But what I always tell my students is the reason why you're in InfoSec is you like to learn. If you don't, you're probably in the wrong profession. So lots of things to learn when it comes to all the different cloud service providers, because they each have their own nuances, and hence the need for the Sec 510 course.
Yes, and regardless of whether or not you want to learn, it ends up being your problem. That's not a problem for the CEO of the organization to solve. That's the problem that you all have to solve. So again, and as we'll see shortly, we're not always the decision makers in this area to begin with, as you'll see in just a few more slides. Now, another reason why we believe that individuals are going multi-cloud, and again, it's borne out in the survey data, is that a lot of people are incorporating different cloud providers when they're creating shadow IT. Now, what do I mean by shadow IT? We define shadow IT in this survey as an account for a provider that was not properly procured. So, for example, a product manager could create a Google Cloud account with their own corporate card, bypassing procurement, and deliver that account to their developers so that the developers can create some kind of application. This is oftentimes done, in my personal experience, because things like your central IT organization or security are blocking the developers. So they say, you know what, security is making my job either miserable or impossible. I'm going to go do my own thing by spinning up a Google Cloud project, which is really easy to do, especially with their very generous free trial. And I think that's part of the reason why we saw that while AWS was introduced to a lot of organizations as a result of shadow IT, Google Cloud had a disproportionate amount of adoption through shadow IT. I think that this is largely because of their free trial, as well as a result of it being pretty easy to spin up a new project on Google Cloud. While at the same time, a lot of organizations are either all in on AWS or all in on Azure, the developers might want to expand their resume by going into Google. I call it resume-driven development. And there's a lot of data. Ken, would you like to talk about the growth trends when it comes to S3 data and other types of resources in the cloud?
Yeah, so I was very curious about this. So when we were designing the questionnaire, we put this question in there, and it was very interesting to see the large number of respondents, somewhere north of 10%, that said that they had over 100 terabyte of data in the public cloud. I worked for one of my clients, they had over 100 petabyte of data. So a petabyte of data, if it was high definition video, would take you 13.3 years to watch. So that's a lot of streaming video. So next year we might add in another column for you have more than 1 petabyte of data, just to kind of tease that out. But I find it fascinating because all this data has to be properly secured. And we're going to get at that as we get into how well do we feel that our organizations are equipped to be able to properly secure that data. We've also noticed that over time, the volume of data has grown. So the way that this question was phrased in the survey was, how much has it grown over the past 3 years, year over year? And we can see that it's, greater than 11% have said that they had more than a 20% increase. And our cloud assets, other assets like virtual machines are growing so quickly. Right. So in the cloud, it's so easy to provision these resources that we often forget why we provision them, but then we're a little bit leery about shutting them off. Well, let me also add the number of buckets is another interesting thing. So one of my clients had over 1,200 buckets across 60 different AWS accounts. And I started asking them, what are all these buckets for? And as we started delving into it, some had customer data, but others had logs, and others were clearly abandoned years ago. So we need to make sure that we're managing this growth properly. So why go multi-cloud? So we wanted to tease out the different reasons. And the largest reason was availability. Availability seemed to be one of the driving factors. But we also noticed that it had to do with improving negotiating position, right? So that might be where you might play AWS off of Azure and Google Cloud off of AWS as an example. So Competition is, of course, very good to us as the cloud customers, but the cloud service providers, they know how the game is played. We also wanted to see to what extent developer preference played a part on that. I'll let Brandon, as a former developer, speak to that.
Yeah, I was just so sad to see that the main reason, the main thing that they said was not important was developer preference outside of other. Now, as we saw from a couple slides ago, if you ignore the developers' desires, they may just go off on their own and create their own cloud accounts. So while this is a table describing what is most important to the decision makers about why they would want to go multi-cloud, that doesn't mean that's necessarily why they end up going multi-cloud. As we saw before, there are some factors that are outside of their control. And perhaps some individuals indicated that through answering in this other section here. But I think it's really unfortunate that they don't take into account developer preference. They're the ones who do so many things in the cloud accounts, especially if you're in a DevOps organization. And it seems to me like that would be an important thing to talk to them about. I don't know. Sounds like it is to me.
And here we have some additional data that shows the influence of these various groups. So we struggled with different ways to present it. So we did stacked bar as well as a weighted average. So executive management, they seem to have the final say in that they have the highest black bar, and finance to a much lesser extent. But then when we look at the weighted average, it seems to somewhat even out in that there's multiple different groups that do indeed have influence into the decision. Next up is cloud agnosticism. So we wanted to define that for you. So we said that a cloud agnostic workload can run on any cloud service provider's platform without requiring refactoring. So I can run my workload in Google Cloud, or I can run that same workload in Azure or AWS, or perhaps any of the other cloud service providers as well. Brandon, I'll let you speak to this because I know this is one of your deep areas of interest.
And this is where I surprise a lot of individuals, because as I mentioned before, I wrote the multi-cloud security course for SANS. I'd like to think that I wrote the course on multi-cloud security. I don't think there's any other course out there that really gives a 33%, 33%, 33% comparison of the big three cloud providers. And I don't like cloud agnosticism very much. I would avoid going multi-cloud if possible, because it adds a whole lot of complexity. When you try to create a cloud agnostic application, what you're basically saying is, I want to opt out of using all of these managed services provided by the cloud providers. So for example, I would not be able to create a cloud agnostic application that uses DynamoDB, because the APIs for DynamoDB do not map at all to the equivalent service in Azure or GCP. So when you make a cloud agnostic application, a single application, mind you, you basically have to either forego using all of those services, or you have to write your application 3 times, one for DynamoDB and one for the analogous services for Azure or GCP. This is a nightmare from a developer's perspective. So as someone with a development background, I would say, hey, we can go multi-cloud if the executive leadership says it's necessary by putting different types of applications in different clouds. But let's avoid trying to make the same application truly multi-cloud, truly agnostic. I know a lot of people think that Kubernetes solves this problem, but again, Kubernetes doesn't have an abstraction layer that allows you to interact with every managed service that AWS, Azure, or GCP has. If you want to leverage those services, you're going to have to make integrations. Now, that's my opinion. Apparently, the industry deeply disagrees. 91% of organizations think that cloud agnosticism is at least somewhat important. And in fact, they said 80% of respondents said that their organizations run identical workloads across multiple clouds, which I think by itself is pretty impressive. And then probably the most surprising thing is that 17% of organizations claim to have all cloud agnostic applications. I am skeptical of this response. It seems almost impossible, but hey, that's what the respondent said. Either way, that's a huge gap between what is important to the respondents versus the reality. Even if they have truly adopted all cloud agnostic applications for 17% of organizations, 91% of organizations think it's important. So you'd think that those numbers would be closer. And I think part of the reason that those numbers aren't closer is because this is such a hard problem to solve.
And I think that this tension is going to continue to exist for a while, because each of the cloud service providers, they're actively trying to differentiate their services so as to display their innovation and remain competitive. By the way, I also wanted to call your attention that we have polls that are appearing in the Slack channels. So we always like to continue the survey process even during our discussion. So join the Slack channel and jump in and participate in our polls. Another very interesting data point is cost optimization. And you might ask yourself, well, why do I, as a security professional, care about cost optimization? Well, as it turns out, I'm a huge fan of cost optimization, because any systems that can be decommissioned are less systems that have to be secured. Any data storage that can be decommissioned is less storage that needs to be protected, less data that needs to be protected. So we also found out, though, that cloud customers admit to being rather fickle. Many of them said, well, 33%, a third of our responses said that they would switch cloud service providers for a savings of $100,000 or more. And of course, the cloud service providers know how to play this game. They will provide incentives for you in the form of rebates or professional service, free professional service, to incentivize you to make this jump. Next up is multi-cloud security technologies. So one of the questions that we wanted to look at was to see, how are people using the cloud to address their various security requirements? And here we see that one of the main uses of cloud services is to help with their security and compliance needs. And it kind of tapers down as we get into things like incident response. We also wanted to know, on a technology by technology basis, which of the cloud services are being used and to what extent. So the blue bar, never, and then the magenta bar on the right of each stack is extensively. So one of the things that we cover fairly in depth is the value of org policies. What I like about org policies is we can stop playing whack-a-mole, right? It's a long-held axiom that we at SANS have always said, that prevention is good, but detection is a must. But what I like to say is, if we can use preventive controls like org policies, then we can stop playing whack-a-mole, right? We can prevent violations of security policy across the board by using an organizational policy. And then there's other technologies like private endpoints that we'd like to see used more of.
In particular, folks, turn on your flow logs. I mean, if 4.5% of organizations are responding saying that they never use flow logs, that's unfortunate, because if you don't turn on flow logs, you don't have access to them. By default, all the big three cloud providers have flow logging turned off, and you're really going to want to turn that on, because if there's an incident that happens, you're going to want to have that information. You can't go backwards.
Absolutely. we're talking about the ability for anybody with a credit card to create a shadow IT account. So what is a security team or a chief information security officer to do? Well, one possible solution is to use a cloud access security broker or a secure access service edge, right? So now these are marketing buzzwords, but the idea behind a cloud access security broker is it brokers your interactions to cloud services from your corporate environment, your corporate managed devices, or to your corporate managed cloud services. So you get all three of those. So we wanted to know to what extent was CASB or SASE being looked at or used. And what we said, or what we found, was that the orange sliver was the folks that are using either CASB or SASE to control access to all cloud services. So that is phenomenal. The blue button, the blue pie, are folks that say we're not using it and we do not plan to use this technology. So there are certain parts of the world where this might bump up against some of the privacy laws. So, but we're going to hear more from some of our sponsors that are in this space. So I'm looking forward to those talks as well. And then for logging services. So everyone wanted to take a look at the cloud logging services that are offered by big three cloud service providers. And then we also saw that the right cluster is the other third-party logging services. So there are people that are using third-party logging services quite extensively. And one possible reason for that is because they want to do it in a cloud agnostic manner, right? They want to be able to pull in their logs from Google Cloud Platform along with their Azure and AWS logs. So let's talk about securing multi-cloud infrastructure and data.
So yes, all these cloud technologies, these security technologies, if you're using them, that's great. But if you don't actually know what you're securing, that may not be as effective as folks assume, right? Oh, we're using a secure cloud, we're using security services, we must be covered, right? Not quite. You kind of need to know how these things actually work. And we were pretty shocked to learn that 8 to 19%, depending on the service that we were talking about, claimed that they were not at all prepared to secure that service. And that's even true about storage. We talked about AWS S3, Azure storage, Google Cloud storage. We talked about hundreds of terabytes being in these buckets and containers. And yet, many organizations are saying that they are completely unprepared to secure these services. Amazon S3, 10.8% of respondents said that they were completely unprepared, not at all prepared. So I think that really shows the importance of education in this area. And I think that's a big reason why the SANS Cloud curriculum exists, not to make a huge sales pitch here, but we can't just go about saying, oh, we're using a secure cloud with security services. You kind of need to know how these things work. Now, one area in particular that we really need to understand is compute. Compute is one of the most foundational parts of the cloud, the ability to run virtual machines or containers or serverless, what have you. You need that in order to run applications. And we talk a lot about how to secure compute here at SANS. And one of the incidents that resulted in us talking so much about compute was the huge Capital One breach that happened in July of 2019. Now, for those who did not hear about this breach, I don't know how that's possible, but for those who are not aware of how that breach happened, it related to this legacy instance metadata service. Now, talking about what that is out of scope for this. We talk about it extensively here at SANS, and we've had a lot of free webcasts on the subject. But we've been talking about this for 3 years now. And yet, as you can see here, there's a very significant number of individuals that have stated that they did not turn off that legacy instance metadata service. Capital One was not an isolated incident. There are many organizations that have a similar vulnerability to Capital One. And frankly, that vulnerability can be solved so easily. Turning off the IMDS-v1 is so simple. And yet, the vast majority of respondents said, hey, we haven't done that yet. And some of them even say that they don't have a plan for this. So that's quite unfortunate, I would say. And that's all we got for today. And Ken, you're on mute once.
Yeah. So next up, we're going to have Bob Hensman from Infoblox give us his perspective.
All right. Well, thank you all for inviting me here. I'm actually excited about this report. I've participated in a number of these reports from SANS. I'll actually be referring to some of the earlier work that they've done that is going to play in here as well and supplement. I'm not seeming to be able to move the slides. There we go. All right. So you saw this slide or an upgraded version of it because I prepared these slides using the draft report. Took a look at the data, and you'll see why I dug into the draft report here in just a moment. And I was looking at this, and both Ken and Brandon talked about this. Matter of fact, Brandon talked a lot about the flow logging and how important that was. But at a glance, this data makes it look like, hey, look, the taller bars are on the left, with the green bars, of course, really pronounced sticking out there. And that's, indicating the people who often use this kind of data. But if we move to the next slide and take a look at what happens when we aggregate the often used, the frequently used, and the extensively used, there we go. You'll see that actually the last three categories seem to be top security concerns around VPN and encryption, and the applications that are being used in the cloud, and how do we secure them? I mean, I've been in this industry for a long time, and it kind of swings, the pendulum swings between low-level threats, because originally all the viruses, they were distributed on floppy disk or bulletin board systems, and they directly targeted your systems at a very low level, the OS, or even at the BIOS and hardware level. Then they moved up to the applications, mainly browsers. Then they just continue to shift, and applications are currently a big part of your security concerns, because that's where the vulnerabilities are. And again, both Brandon and Ken were just talking about some of those vulnerabilities when you set up these cloud services. I mean, I remember reading all of the reports, and I really got upset with the press, because they'd say, hey, Amazon had another breach. No, a user using Amazon wrong that didn't set it up right, who configured it incorrectly, they had a breach. Amazon had the tools, they had the training. I got involved early on, and they had some great educational services there to help you learn how to use those systems. SANS has kind of helped connect the dots between all those little pieces, but the training was there. It was just people moving too fast, not taking the time to learn the systems, which Brandon was hitting on there. But the key thing here that jumped out to me when I started aggregating these different data points was that applications continue to be a big concern. So on my next slide here, there's another graph that they've got here in the presentation, or in the report, that I wanted to highlight. There we go. This is about outsourcing services. Now, there was actually a SANS 2022 SOC survey that was done not too long ago. And in that, one of the things they looked at very closely was, of all the different things that you do, how much do you do internally, and how much do you outsource to a third party for professional services? A lot of different areas of security, talking around best practices of a SOC. But here we're zeroing in, and it's a follow-up survey that again highlights that application security assessments, this is where we need help. You don't have the time to reverse engineer everything, to stay on top of every possible tool that could help you do reverse engineering or vulnerability assessments on the applications that you depend on. So it makes sense to outsource this to somebody who specializes, and again, make sure that you don't skip anything. But the key here is I was really surprised to see that the application assessments exceeded the penetration assessments significantly. I mean, pen testing is something that I'm still surprised a lot of companies don't do it very frequently. It's a sporadic thing. They tend to do it after they've had a problem, because it is time consuming, and that therefore there's expenses tied to it. And it's not like we have spare cycles, so we try to, cut back where we can. But pen testing and security audits are things that are not being done enough. So I was really surprised to see the application security assessments really pop out. So on the application side, and I think, I'm trying to remember if it was Ken or Brandon who were talking about shadow IT. I think it was Brandon early on the shadow IT side. So the problem with shadow IT is first, the insecure applications. That's why all that vulnerability assessment is so important. We just, and it's something you can't just do once, because I mean, how many times have you seen, what was it, last year at Christmas, when certain applications were under attack because there was vulnerabilities in them, and then a patch was released, and the patched that vulnerability, introduced new vulnerabilities. This is common. It happens in all kinds of applications across the board. So that's why I'm not going to mention any names, because it doesn't matter. The problem is applications do have vulnerabilities, and they're going to continue to have them. You just have to stay on top of it. And again, for those of you who've been in the industry a long time, you may remember when everybody said, oh, it's Internet Explorer. It's always Internet Explorer. Well, it's Internet Explorer because that was the most popular platform. And if we can find a vulnerability in it, I, as a bad guy, then I have the broadest potential, number of victims. So of course they're going to go after it. It's the popular thing. I remember when Microsoft viruses first started coming out with the early PC, but people seem to forget most of the viruses are on Apple PC before that. As soon as sales of IBM PCs exceeded those of Apple's, all of a sudden the viruses moved to that. So the viruses are going to go after the most popular platform. So an insecure application is any application that is popular or will get them what they want, particularly, and I have to add that last part in because of the targeted attacks. Then you have the insider threat. And kind of the insecure application is more of, I'm thinking of an insider who's accidentally involved in a threat. But what about the intentional one, that they're leaving the company soon and they want to take their list of employee or customers with them, or maybe they want to take some snippets of code that they developed while they're there because they thought that was really good work and they'd like to leverage it in the future. But this is proprietary stuff. And then of course there's the regulatory concerns. We have to stay on top of that. There's new laws coming out and changing quite frequently. Right now, the scary part is the fines that are coming out. In the European Union, some new regulations have come out that you can get fined because of a breach under one law, but still also get penalized under GDPR. And I just read an article about in Australia, they put a $50 million fine over certain kinds of data breaches. So if you were operating out of Australia, and you had customers in the EU, you could get fined 3 times, once by the Australian government, once by the GDPR, and once by these new laws that are coming out at a country level. I mean, the regulatory compliance requirements are becoming more important. Even if they aren't getting more complicated, we can't ignore them anymore. You can't just say, well, we'll pay the fine, we'll let our lawyers fight it. Those fines are getting massive. So let's go on to one other data point here I'm going to share, and this is kind of a blatant screenshot of our product. I've trimmed most of the stuff off, but that's where this came from. And this is actually from an actual customer doing some application monitoring. Now, shadow IT used to be a really nasty word, and you can't have anything if it's not official. There was the application police that would monitor all of this. But in today's world where you've got to be so agile and flexible, IT can't do that anymore. And the SecOps team can't do that anymore. We can't control everything. We have to allow for a certain amount of flexibility, or the organization can't survive. They can't merge. And you won't know when some of this stuff's happening. People will find a way around with it. So why not have something that can monitor this? Cisco's on this call today. They have apps. Lots of people have apps to do this. So, and I just gave a pitch out to one of my biggest competitors, because the key thing is that you need to know these tools exist. Anything that can give you visibility into the applications being used, like in this case here, you see that they're talking about the number of requests. Now, this is supported by requests, not the number of users. So which of these cloud storage applications are getting used a lot? And there's about 5 or 6 that are considered approved by this company. But you'll notice the list kind of scrolls right off the bottom of the page. And that's because people are using all sorts of applications. Sometimes you can't dictate a cloud storage app. For example, just sharing my slides with SANS, I was required to use Dropbox, which is not an approved application of my company, Infoblox. We have different standards. So, you're going to end up seeing a lot of this. You can't block it, but you can stay aware. And there's some value in staying aware. For example, let's go here. Let's see. The builds are a little slow. There we go. Yandex. Yandex showed up on this list. Only 29 people seem to be using it. A little over 4,000 applications or requests to use the service. This is, and I'll point out Yandex, I'm not picking on them other than the fact that this is a Russian-based service. And the company that this is an actual screenshot I said from an actual customer, they're not allowed to do any work with any services or use any services out of Russia. So this popped up on them and they contacted Yandex. Yandex is actually moving out of Russia now. And it's because they received pressure from customers. You guys have power over your vendors. Just keep that in mind. And Yandex is actually moving out of Russia. They're trying to spin off that part of the business so that they can actually provide a service people can have confidence in. But they would never have known this if they hadn't looked at it. And keep in mind, this isn't their official one, but they found that there were people in the organization who needed to use this. There were certain business reasons it had to be there, and they couldn't get rid of it. So they were they were now aware and could take steps to make it safe. So we move on here, and there's another thing here that I thought was interesting. In the report, just as an example, they talked about Firebase. Now, Firebase is an open source kind of database storage tool that is being used a lot. I'm trying to advance this slide. There we go. So Firebase is something that is being used as as a developer kit. A lot of people write applications. It was produced by Google. A lot of Android apps use it. Matter of fact, in the report, they showed that thousands of apps are using it, but it's like some of these other services we talked about. The people who developed it didn't use it right. And so, it's not encrypted. Things are in the open. It's easily accessible. People can steal information out of it. Well, that might be okay for certain games or something on your Android phone, but this was also used, as you can see, by a fair percentage of organizations in the survey. 54.5% said, yes, they are using Firebase in the organization in some capacity. Now, if this was even a shadow IT thing where it's not official, they still need to be aware of it. And as you can see, if I take this on the next slide and add the row from that report we were just looking at, there was a row on FileStack. FileStack uses Firebase. So, we didn't see Firebase in that, but you need to understand what apps are on your network that are being used in the cloud by your users. And if you saw FileStack and you just a Google of FileStack will tell you FileStack uses Firebase. So you really need to know what's on your network from an application standpoint to understand where your exposures are, so you can then take appropriate measures, whether it's contacting the vendor and trying to take some steps to at least support those parts of the organization that depend on it, maybe doing a little research and finding out that the people using it simply didn't know there was an alternative. So there's a lot of things going on here that, again, you wouldn't even do it. You wouldn't know to do it if you didn't have that visibility. So one final screenshot here of a similar report, but in this case, instead of looking at storage services, we're going to look at VPNs. We're going to look at security tools in use on the platform. And again, this is that same customer. They sorted on VPNs. They had 3 that were official, but they were really surprised to find a lot of additional VPNs. But this is, again, another example of where they couldn't control it because certain services that were partners of theirs, in order to go into their systems, you had to have that VPN. They only supported that VPN. And some of them are more open VPNs, and there's some services that makes them intercompatible, but that was not an option in some of these cases. But without this visibility, they never would have known. And they actually did find that in one case, one of their employees was actually stealing data. I'm not going to point out which one because it doesn't matter what service they were using. It was a legitimate service. It was just being used for an inappropriate way. So there's a lot of good information in this survey. So I'm just going to put a pitch. I had 15 minutes to extract the things that I thought was most relevant. And the applications and use on your network is something that I think is really important, particularly as you spin up, Kubernetes and other virtual machines in the cloud. Those applications remain vulnerable. And in some cases, their vulnerabilities, if it was on an appliance in your facility, it's one thing. Oh, in order to exploit that vulnerability, you've got to physically access the machine. You've got to, insert a USB and so forth. I mean, I've seen a lot of those kinds of reports all hyped in the news. Oh no, such and such application has a vulnerability. When you read into it, it's like, yeah, well, in order to take advantage of that vulnerability, you must first break into security, get into the secure data center, et cetera, et cetera. It really wasn't much of a risk. But as people start moving things into the cloud, those things are being designed to be accessed remotely, and that's a risk. So I thank you very much for your time, and I guess we'll be turning it on to the next person.
All right, well, thank you very much, Bob. So you'll be able to contact Bob via the sponsor business card swamp channel. So please do that. Let's advance to the next slide, please. All right, so next up we have Todd from Corelight. So thank you for being with us today, Todd. Take it away, please.
Thank you. Hey, happy to be here. So I took a little bit of a different look at the survey, and I wanted to understand how I could use my 15 minutes to best help the audience here. What I really did was kind of try to look at the meta trends that I could observe in the overall survey for multi-cloud and figure out a way that I could use my 15 minutes to say, here's some observations, here's some pointers, here's some things that might help you guys out with your security posture as you migrate to the cloud or evolve into the cloud. So as pointed out in the survey, 75% of you guys are moving to the cloud, which is awesome. That's great. But only about 33% of you were really comfortable with your cloud security solutions, which is less great, a little bit scary. So that sort of thing is something as a security practitioner that I have concerns with, obviously, and I don't want anyone to go in and feel insecure or feel like they don't know what they're getting themselves into. So my talk track will be a little bit about some pointers and some things you can do to help understand what will change and what will shift as you go from an on-premise to a cloud environment. Second point on here is really great news, right? The foundations of IT security for as long as I've been in the industry haven't really changed that much, right? So you need 3 things essentially, and this is my opinion of how I boil things down. I like to simplify things so that I can really understand and grok it, but I boil it down to three things. Visibility, right? So obviously Bob's just talked about how important visibility is across your entire deployment, on-prem, cloud, whatever it is. I don't think anyone would argue that visibility is a bad thing with IT security. You can't secure what you can't see, right? Second thing is prioritization. And when I say prioritization, it's the ability to understand what things matter, what things are the most important for your InfoSec team, your security, your IR response team to actually solve, right? And lastly is remediation. And remediation can mean many things. It could mean SOAR vendors. It could could mean cloud native remediation. It could mean all sorts of different things. As Brandon and Ken talked about, in the cloud, a lot of it is policy and configuration. So your remediation path might be adjusting a policy, adjusting a security group, or adjusting a security group rule. So those are the types of things that we want to go through over the next few minutes here. Third bullet here is really ensure your vendors, or whatever vendors you're looking at in the InfoSec space, have a firm grasp of what it means to extend into the cloud. Some people, for example, tend to think of everything as lift and shift, but for cloud practitioners, we know that's not really true. There is auto scaling. There are containers that come into the mix. There are functions as a service. If you are truly using the cloud for what it is meant to be used for, then you will know that all these ephemeral services are in the cloud and they need to be watched just like anything else. So let's walk through a little bit of a use case. I picked network-based because of what I do for a living and where we are in the space. So hopefully we can learn some things as we walk through this use case. All right, so what's different between on-premise and cloud? On-premise, as you can see on the left, is very neatly organized, right? So if you think of the evolution of computing, on-premise has been here for a long time. It's very well organized. It's very well understood. And so you get diagrams like on the left here, which are very defined. There's certain things that you know. For example, you know where to tap in and observe north-south traffic, right? Typically, there's a firewall going to the outside world. You know, you can tap off of there. East-west, same thing. You have routers, switches, all sorts of things. Inside my house, I have a router that I tap into just because I'm a nerd. These are the types of things that are well known. NDR, for example, network detection and remediation, very mature and established inside on-prem. And infrastructure. The infrastructure tends to be relatively static. So when I say static, I don't mean, oh, it's going to be standard and it will never change. I mean that I used to, a long time ago, be a rack and stacker. And if anyone knows what that means, it's racking and stacking servers, wiring them up, and it's a lot of work. So on-premise, you tend to have things that are a little bit more defined and stable. Flip over to the cloud. Wow, the cloud can be whatever you want. Software and all its network can be defined at will, right? So anyone who's been in AWS, Azure, GCP, any of the cloud vendors knows that you get a big giant menu and you can click till your heart's content and spin up whatever you want, which is crazy. And then on top of that, defined on policies and configurations, you can let it talk to whatever you want, including the public internet. Someone mentioned a few breaches in the past, and we know that misconfigurations and errant policies are a big threat in the cloud. Those are the types of things that you want to look for and you want to understand as you're going forward. But how do you get visibility into those? How do you get to the point where your tool sets can see all of those? From a network perspective, you also want visibility into your network traffic. Yes, there are industry recommended best practices to do. Okay, you need to silo, you need to do configurations that won't allow crosstalk traffic, but we all know that no world is perfect. So you want to be able to see that. So we want to understand where the collection points are and where you can get a little bit of that visibility back, or hopefully a lot of that visibility back. Lastly, you want to understand that everything's ephemeral, period, right? If you're using auto scaling, you know that everything will spin up and then it'll come back down. You know that IP addresses will recycle. You know that if you're using containers, that's like the Wild West of natting, right? Because network address translation behind a Kubernetes layer is just insane. So you want to be able to understand all that. So this was a little bit of the doom and gloom slide. And then we wanted to jump into, okay, so let's take the top 3 problems that I take away from looking at cloud versus on-prem and understand what we can do. So first one, there is no guaranteed stable point of data collection for network data. That is relatively true, but there's hope, right? Cloud providers understand that people want to tap into their network data. They want to see those PCAPs. They want to understand what's going on, so they have the evidence to do incident response. So 2 of the 3 majors have virtual tap and mirroring enabled. The third one says it's coming. Don't know if that's true, but they understand the need. We talk to them daily. We talk to everyone daily, and those sorts of solutions are out there. There's an entire industry in there that will do packet collection and mirroring, right? So if you don't have a native solution, you will have a third-party solution. Second point in here is there's software-defined policies and configurations. Yeah, there's tons of them, right? And there are tools that are popularly adopted in the cloud that don't even really have an effect or exist on-prem. So that's kind of where Brandon was talking about, hey, how are 80% of you guys truly cloud agnostic in your application? That's a tough thing to do, right? Because even though all 3 of the majors have similar services, having been in cloud security for a while, I can tell you that there are different methodologies and different uses for each one of those, right? So there's different ways you need to use them. So one other way to look at it is make sure that your security tools are actually utilizing and getting visibility from the cloud native services in a semi-normalized way. Third thing, everything's ephemeral and constantly changing. So what does that mean? That means that you need to have more data than just an IP address. You need to have enough data to effectively investigate and understand what's going on so you can prioritize. All right, so judging on or pulling on the thread of that last comment I made around IP addresses, let's take a quick example here. IP addresses inside of a cloud environment. They're always changing, they're always natting, they're always moving around. Inside of Kubernetes, that problem gets worse. So what do you really need? You want your security tool to give you all the data you need. So from IP addresses being a unique identifier, you actually shift. You want your tools to be able to understand what's the instance name, what's the instance ID, what's the VPC it's in, what security group is it in? And these are all AWS terms, but they are applicable across everything. That's the real data that will allow you to do that second point. You have the visibility. Now you need to be able to prioritize and understand the threats inside of your environment. That's kind of where you need to take a look if you're looking at security tools in the cloud from an on-prem perspective and understand, are they extensible? Can they actually get me the data I need? Can they do what I need across a cloud environment? So kind of wrapping things up here, I know this was a blitz of a talk and it was a bit rushed because it's 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. Number 1, extend visibility. Everyone said it. Everyone, I'm sure, will keep saying it, that visibility is paramount. In the cloud, in the on-premise world, you definitely know how to get it. In the cloud, you have to get it a different way, and you have to make sure the tools you're looking at can get you as far as you need to go. If you're using containers, do they cover it? If you're using EKS or AKS, can you get visibility into those? Those are things you have to think about. 2, effectively investigate alerts. Are they bringing you the data you need to make your incident response as quick and efficient as possible? Do you get all the enriched data, all the cloud-specific data to know, hey, that is a problem because that workload is running my main web application, and if that goes down, I'm hosed, right? Those are the types of things. Make sure that it's bringing you enough data to make your incident response or your security teams enabled to remediate. And 3, we're in a weird macroeconomic time. What tools do you have that will give you a wide breadth? Everyone knows cloud service providers have native tools, but do you really want to spend your calories and your budget integrating with each and every one of them? Or do you want to find a tool that can integrate with your on-prem and multiple cloud vendors? You want to find something that will spread it out and solve as many problems as possible. Get the amount of visibility and data you need in one tool, but then you can solve problems for other tools. So that's the sort of integration and efficiency that you're going to be looking for in cloud native tools. And I know that I'm bumping up on time, so I will cut myself off there. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to being on the panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Todd. Next slide, please. All right, wonderful. So next up we have Kedar, and Kedar is with Cisco Umbrella. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for sponsoring Kedar. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
All right, let's do this. I'm just trying to, there we go. So hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the top threats in the multi-cloud environment. Here's some trivia before we begin. In Back to the Future, how much energy is needed to pass through the flux capacitor to achieve time travel? Any guesses out there? Oh, come on, I know there's some Back to the Future fans out there, of course. 1.21 gigawatts, come on. As well as what European country is located in the continent of South America? Any guesses? Any guesses? Come on! You all knew French Guiana, right? Let's get moving. So the top threats here. This is the agenda for today. Let's go through some of the top threats. So while this isn't exactly new stuff, just as cybersecurity becomes harder to break, these types of cyber attacks are equally more complex. So here are the top 4 cyber threats: malware, phishing, command and control, and crypto mining. And let's go ahead and take a deeper dive into it. So when it comes to malware, malware obviously is designed to destroy computer systems, making it really difficult for your business operations to operate, to function. Nearly 48% of companies have experienced malware attacks, and when they do succeed, it comes really at a steep price. CBS News reported the world's largest meat processing company, JBS Food, this happened a couple years ago, paid nearly $11 million in ransom to cyber criminals after its systems went down due to a malware attack. Now I know what you're thinking. This is it's a meat packing company, so a bunch of vegetarians can form together and hack JBS's cloud network and loaded the systems with malware. And while that could be the case, no one is laughing over the $11 million payout by JBS to get their systems back online. So as well, here in the United States, we know that the average cost of a data breach has risen to $9.44 million in 2022. So obviously, it's almost like this is kind of like a lucrative business. So when it comes to phishing, so phishing is all about sending fraudulent communications. 86% of companies have really gotten at least one of these at some point. I'm sure that we've all received that fake, that scammer email. Are there any Shark Tank fans out there? I'm sure there are a whole bunch of Shark Tank fans out there. So actually, Barbara Corcoran, she nearly fell victim to a phishing scam. She received an email that looked to be from her assistant. What the scammers did, I believe, was they just changed one letter in her assistant's email and sent that to Barbara, saying she needed to make a payment on an investment property of hers in New York that she was basically renovating, that she needed to submit a payment about almost $400,000. So her accountant clicked on the URL and went ahead with the payment on this forest renovation. So it almost went through, but I believe at the last minute, they were able to ask the payment, the wires actually transferring from going through. So she got lucky. But, if it can happen to Barbara, of Shark Tank, I mean, it can really happen to all of us. We just have to be, just be aware of the communications that we get. So command and control. This is remotely controlling compromised systems. This is up almost 31% since April of 2021. What hackers can do with what hackers can do with C2 attacks. I mean, obviously they can destroy data. You can remotely shut down machines, including entire networks. You can remotely rebooting infected devices to disrupt system operations. Data theft, obviously that's a big part of it. Sensitive company data, such as financial documents can be copied or transferred to an attacker's server. It's really unfortunate, but these things happen, and they happen often. So crypto mining, this is obviously, pretty current, pretty big news right now. Stealing cryptocurrency, crypto mining. This is a growing threat. I promise no cracks at FTS or SBF here in this presentation. But basically, if I set up an Amazon account, spin up, software in AWS, it costs me, let's say, $1,000 to run AWS. And if I want to, mine a cryptocurrency, maybe I'll make, $20. If I mine a Bitcoin, I'll make $20 off of that. But criminals aim to really steal company resources. Now think about a determined attacker who breaks into a Fortune 500 company's resources and gets access to that, multi-cloud network and all those, and that virtual network, and spins up a malware on all these thousands of systems to mine a Bitcoin. So, you have an overhead cost of zero. Because it's not your system, plus $20 times thousands of each of those virtual machines that you now control, and all of a sudden you got yourself a lucrative scam. So really, Cisco Umbrella can prevent and block this from happening. Lots of customers worry about visibility. They want to know about reporting, want to know what happens inside the cloud. And they want to be able to, have availability to see these trends. Umbrella does this well. We're cloud native on both sides, so we've got APIs to integrate with other services. We report all cloud activity and trends, so you'll be able to see the transactions of what goes on, and more importantly, what doesn't go on. So now let's talk about Cisco Umbrella and how we basically prevent, these crippling attacks from happening. With cybersecurity evolving towards a more, a secure access service edge, a SASE future, as you can see by the survey results in the upper right, about 45% of the market has already moved to a CASB or SaaS model. So there's a large gap and untapped market here. Cisco Umbrella is cloud delivered and integrates multiple security components, improving security resilience. Administrators can enforce a common set of security policies no matter where users go to get solid cybersecurity, data protection, better user experience, and more importantly, an optimized network performance, really in a matter of minutes. But by deploying Umbrella from the cloud, there's no hardware to install and no software to manually update. Umbrella really has a robust set of security capabilities, including DNS layer security, SWG, cloud delivered firewall, CASB, threat intelligence, remote browser isolation, that's RBI for you baseball fans out there, data loss prevention, cloud malware detection. All this is part of a single integrated cloud service. Umbrella at scale in a multi-cloud environment. Umbrella at scale looks very much like Umbrella in smaller deployments. The open API feature allows developers to build on, extend, and integrate with Cisco cloud security platforms. So even as you distribute applications across multiple cloud services, you'll always have Umbrella protection for your complete multi-cloud environment. Our virtual appliances can run natively on most cloud services, and including Amazon, Google, Azure, Oracle, and so on. Many customers also deploy a Cisco Secure Client, formerly known as AnyConnect, on their virtual desktops in the cloud to get Umbrella protection, whether it's in the cloud, in multiple cloud environments, on virtual desktops. So wherever they really go, you'll always have that Umbrella protection. There are no additional agents to deploy, no end user action is required, and no performance is ever really sacrificed. As well, with each cloud service in your multi-cloud environment, you can set your own independent umbrella policies, allowing restricting access, blocking domains, content filtering, and other such security features. There's also Cisco Inner-Site Workload Optimizer. That is a multi-cloud application resource management solution that visualizes complex interdependencies across all layers of infrastructure and makes recommendations to ensure that the user experience is always at the lowest cost. You can safely and efficiently migrate workloads from on-premises to the public cloud and vice versa to really minimize costs and maximize efficiency. You can accelerate and you'll be accelerating and de-risking your multi-cloud projects. A little bit about the AI, of course, the workload optimizer interacts with public and private environment through the API calls to targets from hypervisor management systems and Kubernetes clusters to storage arrays and APM tools and public cloud applications. The more targets it interacts with, of course, the smarter the API gets. So how Umbrella helps? Of course, Umbrella, it's really a no-brainer and a must-have for businesses because it is really, truly the foundational piece when it comes for security. It can be deployed in minutes. I know the security features here that are listed, it looks exhausting, right? It looks daunting almost to read all this stuff, but we have something for everything. We have something to really counter these top threats that I listed. If JBS, the meatpacking company, had Umbrella, maybe the vegetarian hackers, their malware attack, could have been halted. If Umbrella, if Barbara had Umbrella, of Shark Tank, if Barbara had Umbrella, Umbrella would have intelligently deciphered, these phishing hacks, these phishing emails. For C2 command and control, Umbrella prevents obviously against data theft. We're talking about crypto mining, the crypto heist. I mean, it's all about threat intelligence and incident response, protecting against external threats, identifying patterns in egregious online behavior to not only stop the current crypto mining scam, but also prevent future attacks from happening, really safeguarding your computing environment, your computing network, from virtual networks to all the way to the multi-cloud environment. Look, I've talked enough today. I know it's a whole lot to take in, in 15 minutes, but the proof is in the pudding. As the quote says here, Umbrella really gives the visibility you need to identify attacks, respond to threats, and most importantly, stop what's currently happening, but also prevent, future occurrences, future attacks from ever happening as well. There are a number of surveys and data from Tech Validate and others with customers really expressing, quicker incident response and reduction in malware, but overall just better operational efficiency. Obviously, some next steps, you can check out a data, you can check out a free trial. If you have any questions, just let me know. Appreciate the time. Thank you very much. And I'll hand it back over.
Great. Thank you, Kedar. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move into our panel discussion. This will be our first of two different discussions. So, and our panelists will be the three presenters that we've heard talking so far. So let's go ahead. If you're a panelist, please turn on your camera so everybody can see each other. All right. So again, thank you for your suggestions as to questions for the panel. And also wanted to say congratulations to our winner of the hoodie. And that was James Pomeroy. So good job. All right, so let's jump into some of our questions. Let's start off with some of the questions that were asked via our participants. So first of all, Pete Helgren said, I'm curious if there are rationales to be made for multi-cloud that go beyond inheriting a cloud environment, such as through a merger and acquisition. In other words, is there a technical or other compelling reason for having a multi-cloud environment? And Kedar, since you just talked, let's have you give us your thoughts about what you're hearing from your customers as to why they have went multi-cloud. And I'm sure this has come up as they've talked to you about how Umbrella might be able to help them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's really a matter of preference, I would think. It's, if you want to have, let's say, your application running on AWS, but you want to have your backup data running on Google Cloud or IBM Cloud. I mean, that's, that there are multiple reasons on why you'd want to do that, right? I mean, that's purely choice, right? I mean, it's like, if a matter if your systems do get compromised, right? Let's say on the AWS side there's an attack on that, then you can always switch over, right? So essentially you can have the application continue to run, but you're essentially using the data, your secondary data that's backed up in a different cloud environment. So it's a matter of preference, but also what's important too is to have a proper, you got to have a proper management piece of software that's aligning these different cloud environments. So they're obviously all operational and functional between each of these different applications.
Todd, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well, because you talked about the importance of visibility into what's going on across your cloud environments. Do you have any thoughts as to why people are going multi-cloud? What are you seeing?
Yeah, a lot of our customer base is large enterprise, fintech, etc. And their concerns revolve around vendor lock. They don't want to be locked into one particular vendor. Two, they want to have effectively some sort of, and this is going to sound weird, some sort of bargaining chip, right? So if you're going in, you're saying, hey, Azure, you're giving me a great deal, you're giving me these discounts, but AWS is giving me some more. You have a little bit of leverage there. And if you have a meaningful path to making that threat reality where people know you have estates in both, then you can actually pull it off. I would say another reason would be some of the services are just not equal, right? It's naive to think that all services are equal across cloud vendors. So people are taking those into account depending on what their workloads are doing.
So what you're saying is they may use what they might consider the best service from the best provider for the particular need that they have.
Yeah, for example, just to give an example here, certain types of network traffic mirroring are better on some services than others. And if you have to adhere to, say, some sort of financial sector compliance, you might not even be able to do it on one cloud service provider. So it'll force your hand and you have to go to a different one.
Yeah, that's great. Bob, I really liked what you had to say during your talk when you gave the Yandex files example, right? So first question is, is a particular cloud service offering like Yandex files in your case, is that approved or is it not approved? The other thing though, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, in this particular case, it was a matter of they had some concerns. They contacted their reps at well, not their reps, a rep, because it wasn't an official service, and talked to them about it. And Yandex gave them some assurances. In their case, they temporarily restricted the use of that service because they, at the time there was no mandate by the government in that country saying, hey, we're going, we need to see all your data. But the risk was there. So they did put some limitations, but it was all temporary. And they used it restrictively for communications with a particular supply chain vendor that they depended on.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And one of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to this is, how you talked about how Yandex made their services available in other regions, right? So we know that the cloud service providers have intentionally made their global services regional, right? So for example, AWS has US East, but they also have US West. They also have service or regions in Asia Pacific and Australia and Europe, as an example. And some of the times it is to comply with the particular requirements of that geography, that legal jurisdiction that they're operating in. So kind of getting into this theme of visibility, can you talk about the importance of knowing where the cloud service provider's service is located?
Yeah, that's actually a key thing. And again, it's great that during this panel, we also have Kadar here on the Cisco, because both their umbrella solution and ours, we have this application discovery capability that it doesn't just tell you, hey, they're using this app, but you can drill into it. We provide context around that so that, Infoblox and Cisco's systems will give you background on it. There was a big story in the news recently where a developer kit that's been used for years is listed as being based in Washington, D.C. So a lot of US government agencies had developed apps around it. But when we dig into it, actually, there's just a mailbox in Washington, D.C. The entire thing is actually in China. And all the information that goes through that tool goes through a cloud service in China. And that rightfully raised some concerns amongst the Department of Defense and other agencies that they discovered, they did some due diligence. They looked at, who's the company, how's it listed, and, okay, it looks legitimate, it looks like a US company. We do a little bit more work on that. And again, I'll give the kudos to my competitor, Cisco and us. We both really dig into this stuff. We have the time to dedicate. We have researchers that are not just looking at threats. We have other people who will dig into this kind of thing, specialists. And so you really do need services like these to provide you that context. You may not even know where to go for half this information. And quite frankly, when I talk to some of the people on our team and ask them, so where do you get this stuff? Halfway through it was like, okay, I'll just trust you. Because there's some really gray and black areas that they have to go sometimes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So one of the questions that came in, and this one was from Scott Gurley, he said, any recommendations for evaluating vendors who have multi-cloud environments, specific assurances to look for, contract languages, controls to look for as examples? So I'm thinking about this from the perspective of many of the participants in our audience today. They may want to know, well, how do we avoid this situation that you just spoke about, where they, maybe they have a mailbox in Silicon Valley or something, but they're actually operating out of China or somewhere else that may be prohibited per their compliance requirements. So I want to start with you, since I was just asking you, but then I want to hear from our other two panelists as well. What are your thoughts?
Well, this is going to be a lot like, and Todd kind of hit up the nail on the head here. They're not the same. So the first thing you want to do is take a look at the different services that they supply. To have a competitive edge, each one has invested heavily in, certain areas, while they all are investing in other areas so that they can, stay not so far behind. But each of them have a strength. Understand those strengths and balance those out with what you need. To the question you asked earlier about, which one should I use and why do people use multi-cloud? I've seen companies that they say, well, these kinds of apps that we're running, this environment's the best one for them because they specialize in it. They have the tools within the cloud, so I don't have to host it here. But my other solutions, I'm putting them over here because it's economical and it gives me the basic what I need stuff. So, you're basically doing an assessment on your needs. Once you've done that, then you want to, do a little bit of research and ask some things like access points. That can be a big issue. They can be headquartered wherever. This is the cloud. But you need to ask them, okay, blow away the clouds. Where's that hardware? That's what you need to know, is where's the hardware that my communications, my data is going to not just be stored, but go through.
Todd, I'd love to get your thoughts. So what would you recommend to cloud customers that they do as part of their due diligence process or their ongoing monitoring of their cloud environment to make sure that they understand where their vendors are operating?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the reason why that is so important these days is certain compliances and regulations, GDPR, Canada sovereignty, all those good things that I'm sure everyone's well aware of. It's always good to understand, and I'm not a lawyer, so definitely not that. Always good to understand, hey, if you are held to one of those standards, to hold the CSP to it and say, when you're working with them or the solution architect or whoever you're working with, say, hey, we need to be held to that. And you guys have to provide us with an infrastructure that adheres to whatever compliance regulation you're being held to. So that's a good tip to start with. Also, just make sure that when you get your finalized environment or infrastructure set up, you have someone in the space look it over for you. Make sure that you can't trust the provider itself, right? So this is where, frankly, all of our panelists come in, where we'll double check, right? You have to have tools that are able to trust but verify. So you get that other information that some of us vendors will provide.
Yeah, definitely getting that visibility that we're talking about. Now, what about the dangers of, you kind of hit on this during your presentation, but I thought that this was awesome. The whole risk of misconfiguration, right? So we're using multiple different cloud service providers. They each have similar but different services. Some of these services are better than others. It seems like the risk of misconfiguration is pretty huge, especially if I might know AWS inside and out, but I don't know Azure as an example. And how do you cope with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are tons of CSPM vendors, and I'm sure some of the panelists right now and later on have solutions in the space. Those guys are supposed to be experts at the configuration monitoring of specific cloud environments for whatever they cover. That is kind of the one layer of defense, and any good security program has multiple layers of defense. But for those raw, like dead simple configuration things that you really don't want to be embarrassed and be on the news about, make sure that your vendors will adhere to certain things like AWS, CIS, AWS foundations, right? Those are kind of table stakes compliance things that you need to do that will make sure that you don't leave, an S3 bucket open to the world and embarrass yourself. So that's a good starting point. Beyond that, you need other layers of security. For example, where we play, you want to be able to see the actual network data and understand where the packets are going. And likewise with the other two panelists here, they're also taking a kind of top level view to make sure they understand the holistic picture of where your data is residing, where your compute's happening, and all of that goodness.
So we know that not everything bad that happens is with a malicious intent. So I'm going to continue this theme with misconfigurations. So Kedar, how could Cisco Umbrella help identify misconfiguration? Do you have any examples of that?
Examples? I mean, oh, come on now. I mean, Cisco's been around since what is it? I think Cisco's been around since 1984. I mean, that means I could go back to talk about examples for almost good 40 years. And by that, what I mean is, look, Todd was mentioning about compliance. I mean, the whole idea here is like, we don't want to wait for something bad to happen first. I mean, we want to make sure that we have security immediately, right away. And with Umbrella, you're getting that protection. I mean, you can deploy it in minutes and get compliance and get results immediately. And this is something that Cisco's been doing for a number of years. And even in a multi-cloud environment, you can, from a single dashboard, you can send out different access, different restrictions, different policies to these different applications in these different cloud environments. So this is something that again, Cisco has not only has done well, but it's also we've done well for a number of years, and that's why Umbrella is really one of the top solutions out there.
Bob, I'm going to come to you next, and the question is from Justin, and he says, "What might be the best advice for a small business just starting to think and use the cloud with the intention of doing it securely?
Well, for your small, medium business, which the definition thereof depends on what part of the world you're in. And, it depends mostly on your staffing, your ability to get involved. A lot of these cloud services, they offer you, and they have a marketplace that they offer you a lot of the other ancillary things you might need, including they'll have links to security tools. And so take a look at the service that might be more full-rounded for you. It's not just a matter of comparing the packages. I mean, that's still part of it, but see if there's one that can pretty much simplify the process for you. I mean, the smaller you are, the less bandwidth you have to try and figure out how to do things. And if they've got something that says, hey, here's vendor X, they're in our marketplace, click this button and it'll deploy. Those are the kinds of things you're looking for, easy to roll out. Even large enterprises are stressed. I mean, I hate to talk about how hard it is to hire, experienced security personnel. We've been talking about that for almost a decade now. That's always a problem. There's a shortage of skilled people everywhere. And so the more that the cloud provider can give you, the better. But then you also want to take a look at your other options. You have resellers that you buy things through them. They may also provide some of those services. So balance where you can get services around products, particularly in the small, medium business. You can't afford to buy products and do it all yourselves. You've got to make sure you've got the services behind it.
Todd, what would your answer to this be? What would the top advice you'd give to a small business that was wanting to enter the cloud and do it in a secure manner?
Yeah, I think Bob brought up some great points, and I don't disagree with anything he said. I would say another angle I would look at it is, whatever your product is, and I don't know, obviously, make sure that it is adaptable. Your cloud service provider is adaptable to it. So for example, if you're going into government space, you're not going to pick GCP because they're not strong in that. You might pick Azure because they have a giant GovCloud installation. So it's kind of taking a little bit of a step back and looking at where's your target audience, where's your target customer base, and understanding where they're going to want to consume your product. Even if it's a SaaS service, sometimes you'll find that, obviously porting data from one SaaS service to another can be very expensive. So if you find that your target audience, the majority is AWS, maybe you want to start out there first, so then your data portability costs come down a little bit.
Excellent point. Kadar, do you have any thoughts for us on this?
Yeah, of
question?
course. Just as Todd and Bob were mentioning, I mean, here at Cisco, it's all about, we power an inclusive future for all. So, I mean, regardless of whether you're a large scale enterprise or, a mom and pop Radio Shack, I mean, we're really trying to just give you the security that you need. And if you want, if you're starting something new, going for the cloud, that's the right approach. Just make sure you have, proper security behind it, because you just don't want to have that oh no moment.
Great. So I'm going to share my thoughts. So when you look at everything that each of the large cloud services providers have to offer, as an example, you look at the service catalog of AWS, over 175 different services. So as somebody starting to use the cloud, you don't have to use every single one of those services. And in fact, what I would say is don't have a formal process for deciding which services you're going to add to your quote unquote allow list. And I would also do that on a region by region basis. What regions do you intend to operate? And then add those to your allow list using organization policies, right? So that way you don't have to play whack-a-mole. Why do we have this virtual machine running in Singapore? We're not operating in Singapore, right? So you don't have to chase that down. So that would be my thought. And of course, I know that all three of our panelists have solutions to help us detect that, but I would say, let's start with preventing. Let's be intentional. thoughts on that, Kadar, since you're on my screen?
I mean, you kind of, hit it on the head there. I mean, just be compliant, have, know where you're going. And as I said, just, you gotta have security like that. That's really, I feel like that's, and I'm not just saying that, because I'm working in cybersecurity. It's more so like, it's just, you need to have preventative measures, just in case something happens. You really never know who's out there and who's trying to steal from you, and it's better to just be proactive than not.
Yeah, great. Our next question comes from James Pomeroy. Do you see companies using applications in one cloud provider, for example, an application written in Lambda and AWS, for example, but also using another cloud provider for centralized identity, IDP, identity management? For example, an AWS hosted application using Azure IDP. I know many organizations are trying to centralize their identity management for cloud SaaS on one platform, i.e. one identity. So before I turn this question over to our panelists, what I thought I would do is mention some survey findings that we didn't talk about in our presentation, but are definitely covered in our paper. By the way, we have in the Zoom chat, we have a link to the paper that we've just published. We were kind of surprised to see this in our survey results. We found that multiple organizations were using multiple single sign-on vendors, which was, the whole idea of single sign-on is you've got one identity that you're using to access multiple cloud service providers. In fact, we saw many were using 3. So it's, for example, if they're using AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, they were using the identity provider offered by each of those 3 cloud services. And to me, that seems like maybe a symptom of various organizations' lack of quote unquote multi-cloud maturity. So Bob, have you ran across that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I mentioned that with the VPN example and the cloud backup. A lot of people use a lot of different services. Sometimes it's because you've got, we've got a branch in a particular country, and for their compliance reasons, they have to, I worked with a company in Canada that they had offices around the world, but they actually had to provide certain compliance reports in a very specific format, and converting it was a bit of a hassle. This was in a previous life, not Infoblox, so I'm just kind of sharing from my experience, where they found that getting all the data from their different tools and putting it into this format was a bit of a pain. So they had to use a specific tool as their aggregation tool for all security tools. But it didn't work for centralized management and stuff like that. So they had a different tool that they actually used to manage everything. This one was only for reporting. So they had 2 tools, but they were using them for different purposes. I also mentioned where you're dealing with third parties, your supply chain vendors, your partners, that they require you to access their systems using a different tool. So you're going to have those different kinds of tools. And that's where that application visibility that I talked about and Kadar mentioned is so important. You've got to be aware of what's being used and as a baseline. And then when you start seeing odd things show up, then that might be an indication that, okay, let me dig into that. Is some department all of a sudden trying to do something different without checking with us? Or do we have a rogue employee? Todd touched a lot on this as well. There's standards you've got to have. So yeah, you might say this is our single sign-on solution. But when you do this, we have this one. And when you do this, there's going to be exceptions to the rule. That's the way it works. Oops, you're on mute there, Ken. But it looked passionate. It looked passionate.
Yeah. Well, when I'm talking with my hands, that's how people can tell that I'm still on mute. So I'm trying to save everybody from hearing me coughing. I had COVID last week, so I'm on the recovery. But anyway, so Todd, we also talked about the impact of acquisitions and mergers. So continuing the theme of our discussion about identity providers how do we, one of the themes of your talks was prioritization. So what is a medium to large organization? How do they cope with this constant change, especially when they've got multiple identities, multiple identity as a service providers, and maybe they're in the middle of migrations? What's your sage advice for us?
They cope with it as best they can. So an example I'll give is we had a large media provider. I was working with a large media provider, and they literally were an amalgamation of 100+ acquisitions, 100+. They had footprints across the entire globe. Almost any of the cloud service providers that you mentioned today earlier, you could throw a dart and they had something in there. There is no perfect world, right? Nobody's product is perfect. No one on this panel can honestly say their product is perfect, right? But you do the best you can. And what I would say is, back to the prioritization point, is you have to understand, if you're looking at it from, say, specifically IAM perspective, you got to look at where your distribution is and where your need is. So from a top level down, it's, all right, if 80% of your estate is in 3 providers and there is an IAM provider that can cover those 3, it's just a pragmatic way of, hey, maybe we prioritize, consolidate on those. But the likelihood, if you have a large enterprise that's made up of a lot of different acquisitions, of getting one, magic bullet that's going to solve it all is actually pretty low. So I think you're going to pragmatically end up with maybe you can get it down to 2 or 3 vendors or something like that. But yeah, it's a bit of a hard challenge to solve. And of course, it's very dynamic based on what your exact circumstances are.
Yeah, so it seems to me that one of the most important priorities, I would say, is getting the visibility into it, right? So I'm a big advocate of course, the CIS controls, but controls number 1 and 2 is essentially inventory everything, right? So do we know what regions and what cloud services we're using across the globe? Do we know all the different identity providers we're using and so forth? So, and one of the ways that we might get a grip on that is using some sort of tool, whether it's Corelight or Umbrella or Infoblox, to get that visibility and to know how our organization is using the cloud and how that's changing over time.
Ken,
Yeah.
I would also chime in one important aspect of that. I love the idea that you're talking about visibility and assets. We got to keep in mind also, in today's world, we have more devices than we have users. And right. That's not just, BYOD devices. We are getting more intelligent devices, IoT, even if you're not like in a robotics manufacturing facility, we have HVAC systems that are calling back. There are so many things within our environments that are communicating. You've got to have visibility of what they're doing as well. And that's another reason why you might have different clouds. It's not your device, it's the thing you're leasing / subscribing to from another vendor that's inside your network, but still communicates out. Yeah, so there's the device angle too, not just your users and applications.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point, and that is the whole supply chain, right? So our vendors might be a software as a service that's built on somebody else's infrastructure as a service, and they have vendors. One of the things that I would do is leverage the GDPR requirements, where the vendors have to declare who their sub-processors are, right? So that way we now can get that visibility into all the different cloud services that are being used, hopefully. But we got to be intentional about that. We got to ask those questions. So what about bringing the data into a SIM, a security event and information management solution? When we're operating in the cloud, we're talking about large volumes of data that is being collected, and as we start moving this large volume of data from cloud provider A to cloud provider B, we have to pay for the cost of moving that data. it's very time consuming. So, Todd, I'd love to get your thoughts on what is the right solution. Is just to leave the data in place and just summarize it, pull the summarized data into the SIM? Where should the SIM be? What's your thoughts on this?
So the SIM, in my opinion, if you are sophisticated enough to have a SIM, you probably have an IR or a threat hunting team, because they're very expensive and they're an aggregation of all your security tools data, and they're, again, very expensive. We all know that. So what I would recommend would be to take a look at your tool set and make sure that you are only bringing the data that you actually need in the SIM. It's not a great idea to dump ad hoc into a SIM because you're going to pay a fortune. If you can afford to do it, great. But make sure your tool sets are actually optimizing for usage with a SIM. So make sure that they are minimizing down to the exact amount of data that you need whenever possible.
Excellent. Kedar, I'll give you the closing comment before I wrap it up. You have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I mean, so even here at Cisco, right? I mean, Cisco Talos is, I mean, they have like that's like the largest threat intelligence, organization really on the planet. I mean, looking closely at the data, I mean, we resolve almost, I think it's like 620 billion DNS requests, daily DNS requests, across our user base. So, and, that really represents, all markets, geos, protocols, giving really like an unprecedented, view, but more importantly, visibility into the end user. So I think that's just an important part, and security, of course, but just what we're trying to do here is just be compliant, but more importantly, just know what's going on, know who your users are, know what they're doing, know what data traffic's coming in as well as what's going out. These are all I mean, we're all trying to keep keep it safe, right? So that's just a really big part of what we're trying to do here.
That's great. Yep. So I think we need to shift our focus from logging all the things to taking an engineered approach to what is it that we really do need to collect to give us that insight, that actionable intel, that visibility that we need. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for participating on panel 1. We're now going to be taking a short break. Thank you.
Thank you.
Woohoo, I'm done. Better make sure I'm on.
You weren't.
Nice.
You weren't.
Nicely done, Ken.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
We're on a break right now. We'll be back at the beginning of the hour.
All right, folks, welcome back. Looking forward to the rest of this event. Hope that you had some time to stretch your legs. So let's continue. I don't think I have slide control currently. Was I really on mute this whole time?
No, sir, we can hear you 100%.
Okay, it prompted me to unmute. I'm not sure exactly what happened. Okay.
You were on mute, Brandon. I didn't hear anything you said for the last 10 seconds.
All right, let's try this one more time. Hey, everybody, welcome back from your break. It's time for a panel with Microsoft.
All right. Hey, well, thanks, everybody. Let me see if I have control of the slides here. And it looks like I might. Oh, there we go. All right, so let me go back one here. My name is Ken St. Cyr, and I am excited to join everyone today from Microsoft. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues, Herman Opperman from our Incident Response and Recovery practice, and also Jacques Portes, who's one of our security architects. And we have, over the next 30 minutes, planned a couple of things for you. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking through our response and kind of our reaction to some of the great results that came out of the survey conducted by the SANS team here. And then we're going to move into a panel discussion where we're going to do some Q&A with myself, Herman, and Jacques, led by Brandon. So thank you guys for joining us, allowing Microsoft to participate. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the survey here is that it gives us some really great insight into what we're seeing in these multi-cloud scenarios, not just in terms of technology usage, but security and security opportunities. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about some of the challenges that we're seeing in Microsoft as well in these multi-cloud scenarios that I think both validate the results of the survey and also impact a lot of customers and a lot of organizations that are operating in this multi-cloud ecosystem. Now, one thing, I don't know if many folks are aware of this. I want to invite everyone to check out a report that we publish in Microsoft annually. It's called the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. And you're going to find this at aka.ms/MDDR. The Digital Defense Report is something that we've done for the last few years, and we actually just released the report for 2022. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Microsoft and kind of our position as a cloud provider is, as a big hoster, we get lots and lots of data from the cloud environments that our customers have deployed, lots of telemetry and lots of signal. And so we're in this unique position to be able to take in all this data and to analyze it for trends, and in particular, trends in the security space that help us understand some of the challenges and opportunities for us to help secure the environment, secure the world. Now, one of the things that is pervasive in the security space, as everybody knows, there's this constant game of cat and mouse. And it's all about the good guys having better insight and data over the bad guys. And that's something that the cloud providers, not just Microsoft, but all cloud providers can really benefit from, is the amount of data that we can synthesize. So some of these numbers are astounding, right? We look at some of the data we have access to in the cloud platforms. On the far left of the slide, there are 43 trillion signals that we get on a daily basis in Microsoft. And from there, we can then pull those signals through our analytics and our AI platforms to try and get a good understanding of some of the cybercrime activity that we see pervasively happening across not just the Microsoft cloud, but other clouds as well, because we have systems that integrate across multi-cloud environments. I don't want to go into the details on a lot of our telemetry here, but another thing I want to highlight is the Digital Defense Report is contributed to by a number of security organizations within Microsoft. So we have over a dozen of these organizations that analyze and contribute to our insights. We have probably, you guys are familiar with our digital crimes unit, which has been responsible for proactively taking down cyber criminal organizations. We've removed over 10,000 malicious domains used in those cyber criminal attacks. And in particular, I want to call out the work that our incident response and recovery teams do, because we have a number of security experts that are actively involved in helping our customers and organizations recover from these security incidents. And all this to say that the insights that we gain from these recoveries is something that contributes back to our understanding of the state of cybercrime today. So there's one particular thing that I want to kind of hone in on. And let's see if I can advance the slide here. Okay, there's one particular thing I want to hone in on, and this is a trend that's been concerning Microsoft and concerning the security industry at large. And this is the idea that we're starting to see a industrialization of cybercrime. And this is really interesting, right? We've seen various forms of attacks kind of manifest over the years. But this industrialization is really concerning because we're starting to see cybercrime organizations operate at cloud scale and really to operate as cloud service providers. In fact, we're seeing cybercrime as a service become more and more pervasive. Now, our Microsoft Defender EDR technology, we ran an analysis over multiple months to kind of try and understand the state of these cybercrime organizations. And what I have on the screen here is an example of what we've seen manifested through this. I mentioned cybercrime as a service. I want to hone in specifically on one scenario that we think is really important for us to understand, and that's around human-operated ransomware. And really what this manifests itself as is a set of cyber criminal organizations that are operating managed cloud services around ransomware. We see ransomware as a service as a very real platform and a very real threat today, impacting many organizations. And so through our Defender EDR technology, we have attempted to map out how these organizations operate using a lot of that signal and telemetry that I was just talking about. And one of the things that we found is there are a number of ransomware as a service operators that are operating ransomware cloud environments. And affiliate networks purchase these ransomware as a service services almost like a cloud provider sells cloud services to a legitimate customer. And it's really interesting to start to see these cybercrime organizations operating like a legitimate business. So as a cybercrime operator, as a ransomware as a service operator, this operator would sell services to the affiliates. The affiliates will then go to their networks and their channels to collect data around cybercrime or collect data around access that they can then leverage into this ransomware as a service. And so what we see is access brokers on the dark web selling data to these affiliates, selling access to the compromised networks of organizations to these affiliates, which they then take and run through this ransomware as a service platform. The affiliates don't need to be security experts. And this is what's really scary because cybercrime is manifesting outside of the technology expert space and really into other criminal organizations. And so the success model that we've kind of pieced together through our data, which is illustrated in this slide, basically says if an access broker sells 2,500 points of access to compromised networks, and this is really where the human operated aspect of ransomware as a service comes into play. A ransomware affiliate will buy that access, and then they'll go through that list of 2,500 access points, and they'll pick out specific targets that are going to bring them the highest ROI for their ransomware attacks. That's right, we have attackers that are looking at ROI just like legitimate businesses. And so of that 2,500, the human element of those affiliate organizations will narrow those down to what it believes to be the top 60 or so organizations that it can actually ransom and extort and get value from. And then they will pervasively attack those 60 organizations through the ransomware platform. And of those 60 organizations, 33% of them, 20 of them are going to be successfully breached. Of those breached, they're going to get at least one that's going to fall victim to a successful ransomware event. Okay, and so really what this illustrates is the cybercrime organizations industrializing services through the cloud. And one other thing I want to mention real quick before I move on is we're not just seeing this impact organizations from an extortion perspective, but as a ransomware operator, that operator has cloud infrastructure to run, right? And this is already an organization that's operating with malicious intent. So rather than them signing up for an Azure subscription or an AWS account, we're starting to see these cybercrime as a service operators taking over another organization's cloud provider or cloud platform and operating their virtual machines, their software as a service, their ransomware as a service platform within a compromised environment. And this is really scary, right? Because now we're no longer just taking advantage of the data that can be extorted for a company, but we're bringing about financial ruin to them as well by leveraging their capital to run cybercrime services, which is just crazy to think about. Now, one of the other things I want to point out is that this doesn't impact any one particular industry. We're seeing this across the board. I mentioned earlier, our incident response and recovery team spend a lot of time working with a lot of these compromised organizations to help recover from these scenarios. And we've collected a lot of data on what these incident recoveries, these incident response and recovery statistics look like. And what we're finding is about half of these incidents are affecting primarily the manufacturing and health space. And it's probably pretty obvious why, we're seeing some big targets there, right? Manufacturing is often ripe with IoT and OT security concerns. Healthcare data is actually some of the most expensive data on the dark web. If I look at ROI, we see healthcare data in particular getting purchased and used in malicious ways more than any other types of data. And really the reason is mostly for financial gain. We have people purchasing healthcare data of known and prominent individuals in order to blackmail and extort them. But we also see a lot of cyber criminals purchasing healthcare data in order to file fraudulent health claims in order for a financial benefit. There are other industries as well being impacted by these industrialization of cybercrime tactics. We're starting to see some things, especially in 2022. We've seen some really big ones, like on the government side, the Costa Rican government had to declare a state of emergency because of an incident. We see Indian airlines that were attacked and services taken down, leaving thousands of people stranded throughout the world. And even some of the legacy technologies being attacked, right? So if I look at an incident in 2022 in Greece, the mail system was taken down in Greece. I'm not talking about email, I'm talking about snail mail. There was a disruption in snail mail in Greece this year. And so one of the challenges, of course, we're seeing then is that this is no longer just within the digital space. This is breaking through the confines of human interaction. And so that becomes especially worrisome. Now, I mentioned earlier that our incident response and recovery teams have worked with a lot of our customers. I'm not going to drain this slide. I don't want to go too in depth into the data. We're going to talk more about this in the panel in just a few minutes. But I want to highlight a couple of things that we found in some of our recoveries. And in particular, I want you to zero in on that 93% bar in the middle. What this is saying is that in the incident response and recovery scenarios that we've been involved in, 93% of the customers and organizations that we've worked with have had limited controls around privileged access and limited controls preventing lateral movement within the environment. Now, if you look at how a lot of these attacks originate, especially in the cybercrime as a service space, the criminals are looking for a front door. And affiliates, when they purchase access from an access broker, a lot of times that's manifested by a set of credentials. Now, they don't even need privileged user credentials. They just need a credential to get in the front door. And if an organization doesn't have lateral movement controls or privileged access controls, all it takes is a standard user account to get into the environment. And then once that user is in the environment, once the criminal is in the environment as a user, they can start moving laterally within the organization, bouncing from system to system, looking for systems that a privileged access might be used on. And then they'll park and they'll wait. And a lot of times we're actually seeing privileged users being lured into these systems by the criminals, and they'll wait for that system to be used. Once it's used, they'll steal the session, capture the credential, and then they've elevated their privilege up to the next tier. And we see attackers moving up the attack chain in that way. And I think this is why privileged access controls and lateral movement controls are really important to have. I want to point to two other statistics real quick. The one to the right of that, 86% of the customers we work with in incident response and recovery have had a misconfiguration of identity providers. Right, this is something that is totally avoidable, right? We have identity infrastructure, which is the front door of a lot of this, right? We've said in Microsoft often that identity is the control plane for the cloud. This is the front door of a lot of these environments, and a misconfiguration is in place. And then if I look at the statistic to the right of that around multi-factor authentication, 74% of the incident response engagements that we've been involved in haven't had multi-factor multi-factor authentication configured. And if we look at kind of the scenarios around how cybercrime is manifested through an as-a-service approach, you saw earlier that we have cyber criminal organizations, the affiliates. They may be targeting specific companies, but more often what they're doing is looking for the low-hanging fruit. They're looking for the people that they know are extortable, the people who don't have incident response plans in place, people who don't have cybersecurity retainers, and those are the folks they're going after because those are the ones that they know that they can fold easily. And multi-factor authentication is a really easy preventative mechanism to put in place in order to not be in that list of 60 or that list of 20 that get compromised. Now, there's some other great data that we have around security frameworks and practices. We can talk about that in the panel discussion as we move on here. But one thing that I want to plant before we move into the panel discussion and kind of seed this as a thought for us to talk through is in Microsoft, Zero Trust is more than just a buzzword. We know this is a buzzword going throughout the industry. Zero Trust, in a lot of ways, has been painted as a product or as something you can just implement. But in Microsoft, we firmly believe that Zero Trust is a set of principles and frameworks that need to be pervasively implemented across all of your cloud platforms, not just Azure, not just AWS, not just GCP, every platform that you're leveraging, especially in a multi-cloud scenario. And I don't want to drain this slide either, but I do just want to kind of highlight that the way that we approach this, and through our own transformation in Microsoft, we've adopted a fully Zero Trust mindset. This is the framework we've used. And it starts, as you saw with the stats on the prior stage, on the prior slide, it starts with identity, because the identity front door is oftentimes not locked. And we don't just want to lock one room of the house, we want to lock the entire house. So it starts with identity. It also moves into endpoint. We need to make sure that the devices those identities are being used on and the data, apps, and services that are being accessed are also secure and in compliance. And then it moves on to securing the data, right? If you encrypt, classify, and label the data, it makes it less extortable. It also includes securing the application infrastructure, the SaaS applications, as well as the server and service infrastructure as well. And of course, the network layer. And one of the things we often see with Zero Trust is Zero Trust only being talked about within the confines of the network. But we like to paint this picture that Zero Trust is a larger architecture that impacts all of these pieces. All right, and with that, I'm going to take a breath, hand it over to you, Brandon, as we go into our panel discussion here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Ken. So as mentioned, we are going to have a Q&A session now. Please make sure to add your questions in the Q&A section, so I will be able to prompt them to the speakers. But to get started, you ended on talking about network and how Zero Trust is involved with dealing with the network that you're originating from. And as you mentioned in the beginning, identity is the control plane of the cloud. I'm seeing that network controls that security professionals typically rely on are getting less and less effective, especially when so many of the applications and data that we want to expose to our end users are by necessity on the public internet. So what are your thoughts on that and how Zero Trust can maybe transcend network while still considering it?
Yeah, of course. I'll jump in first, and I'll also invite my colleagues Herman and Jacques also to jump in as well. So, I mean, this is very astute, Brandon. As you noted, the boundary of the organization over the past several years has been continually pushed out. Right? We used to have full control over the network. We could put in firewall rules that would prevent outside access, right? Prevent people from connecting in. And, I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, and what you also just highlighted, identity as the control plane. When we lose control over the physical network that we are in ownership of, we have to look at the next virtual boundary that we have control over. And with a zero trust mindset, you're trusting no one by default, which means you're authenticating and validating every connection that comes into your services. And identity as the control plane is that validation layer, or at least starts that validation process, because we need to know who is coming in, under what context are they operating. And so in my mind, in the zero trust framework that we've been just a big proponent of in Microsoft, it starts with making sure that you have a strong identity layer and the identity basics taken care of in order to provide that first line of defense in a world where we no longer own our own network boundaries.
Excellent. And how does this change in a multi-cloud kind of architecture? Does this increase the landscape, or does it in some ways reduce the risk because it exposes additional security capabilities that perhaps not all cloud providers have parity for?
I can take that one, Ken, if that's good. So that's a very good question, Brandon. Some of the challenges that we do see, regardless of cloud vendor, is the configuration of the infrastructure. And I'm going to pick on network for a moment. A lot of customers don't realize that they have full control over all the network configurations in the cloud. And a lot of cases, they don't understand the configuration of how the cloud vendor's infrastructure is put together to expose them to the internet, as an example. And there still needs to be controls to control the egress and ingress traffic from that specific source environment. If it's a specific IaaS kind of environment, for PaaS and SaaS, there's kind of different controls that goes into play there when it comes to Azure Firewall and things like that. But you still need to control the egress traffic. And a lot of the compromises that do take place happen as a result of a server that's got full internet access at that specific moment in time, establishing the command and control channel. So those things need to be considered as well, regardless of cloud vendor. Then there's the connections between the clouds. So now, regardless of what your preference is, a lot of our customers do have multi-clouds, like Azure and AWS. It's a hybrid. They start connecting the clouds together when it comes to identity. So now the network becomes a little bit less of a dependency, and now the identity plays a big role in authentication. So they'll have an identity that's privileged in AWS, that was sourced out of Azure, as an example, or vice versa. They've got an AWS identity that they've invited into an Azure environment. I'm not picking AWS at all. I'm just using that as a scenario. So our customers really need to consider the way they expose the guest accounts or guest access, and also how they configure the actual network infrastructure in those environments to control if that environment does get compromised, that the C2 channels are controlled.
Certainly. And we talk so much about proper security configuration management in SEC 510. It's something that, once again, it's really shocking to me how many times I have to have this conversation. No, using a secure cloud platform does not mean you're secure. You still have to use it properly, because Microsoft or Amazon or Google, whomever, they don't have the context that's needed in order to secure your various workloads. They have no idea what identities to trust and which identities not to trust, and much more.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to just make a quick comment on that, Brandon. One of the things that I think we realized over the years, and kind of early on, is that as a cloud provider, security is really a shared responsibility. There are some things that us as cloud providers have to do, right, which are just inherent. And then there are some things that we have to work with our customers on to make sure that they do. And customers, organizations aren't going to know to do these things by default. So as cloud providers, we need to provide guidance to those customers. And one of the things I want to highlight, and I think this came up earlier in one of our prior discussions, Brandon, that Microsoft, we actually have a cloud security benchmark, a set of guidance that we've developed and released for multi-cloud environments. And even though the guidance we initially released, it was called the Azure Security Benchmark, it was very focused on some of the security controls around Azure itself. And just recently, this past year, we rebranded the Azure Security Benchmark to be the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. And we've also added in AWS security controls into that security guidance as well, along with plans to expand that to other cloud platforms. And so we are really all in on making sure that the security that we have in the cloud ecosystem isn't just impacting, Microsoft itself and our own Azure services. We want to secure every cloud and every organization around the world.
And I'm very interested in reading that benchmark. In SEC 510, we cover the CIS benchmarks, those that are provided by the Center for Internet Security, which are very much focused on one cloud provider. And I think it's really cool that you all are trying to target multi-cloud. But on the subject of shared responsibility, I know that when you say the shared responsibility model, you're referring to the cloud provider as well as the customers. But we have a question in the audience regarding the responsibility within an organization. So Serenity asks, is it helpful for companies to have a separate cloud security department, or do you think that it can be successfully incorporated into existing departments such as incident response? To which my response was initially, hey, it's probably multiple different groups within the security org, such as the application security group. What do you think? I think Jacques might be
Jacques
trying
on mute.
to respond, but once again, we are very bad at using that.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting question, and it depends the organization. Actually, the cloud in terms of security can be seen as a big opportunity. The way you can implement, and it's regardless the cloud provider, the way you can implement guardrails and policy at scale and very prescriptive auditing or blocking, it's much more than what you can do on-prem in most of the case. And so if your security team can evolve and can support different model, because you cannot just apply what you have on-prem to the cloud, I think you are going to miss something in terms of security, miss an opportunity actually. Then perhaps it will be better to develop a separate team. But at the end of the day, you have to see your environment as one. Because if there is so many links between on-prem and the cloud, in terms of identity or others, then if your on-prem is not secure or you're not starting to apply the same level of security you have in the cloud, then it can become a factor of compromising your cloud environment as well. So you have to make sure that your team is working on the cloud for what it is, one. And you have to make sure as well that what you are learning from the cloud or what you are learning from the solution in the cloud, automation, guardrail, compliance as code, can be applied at least partially on-prem when you can. I hope it makes sense and it answers the question.
And if I may add to that, Brandon, just to add to complement Jacques, is I'm going to use Azure PIM as an example, where you use privileged identity management or some sort of JIT service in order to escalate that specific level of privilege at that moment in time. Now, PIM gives you the exact example where you can build an approval workflow to plug into those teams. So now you need to develop those operational practices in order to have the approvals in the back end in play in order to take advantage of the security. If you just have a PIM service with no approval workflow, it just becomes a fancy audit tool. So those are the kind of things that you need to build into those teams as well.
Yeah, and I would also just like to chime in with one additional thought around this. One of the things that we see a lot of customers organizing themselves around is around compliance. And, I just want to urge everyone, just be very careful not to mistake compliance for security. It's one thing to be compliant. Compliance is going to prove, that you're meeting some set of regulations, but you can check all the boxes around compliance and have a team focused on making sure things are compliant and still be insecure. And so having team organized around security controls separate from compliance, I think is an important thing to consider so that you're not mixing those two things, because they're really, even though they're related, they are two separate agendas.
Certainly, security can help with compliance, but not necessarily the other way around. And there's definitely some what's the word, negative intersection. There are things outside of that Venn diagram for sure. My thought process regarding which teams should be responsible for the cloud is I would, take a similar approach to what Jacques mentioned and think of it similarly to on-prem, where you have various teams securing on-prem. Why would that be any different than in the cloud? You need to have a variety of different teams, although you can have some cloud security experts. And I see one of my former colleagues in the Zoom participants, I think he actually just dropped the second I said that, who was a specialist in cloud security, particularly to guide the other security teams. Okay, so the final question I have for now, because we are very close to ending here, is I just wanted to really quickly ask, I know that a lot of people are intimidated by the zero trust buzzword. As mentioned before, I know you see zero trust as much more than a buzzword. What are some of the biggest issues that customers have with getting started with zero trust, and how do they surpass them? And I'm going to challenge you all to keep this answer under 45 seconds.
I'll give you one sentence, and then I'll let Jacques and Herman weigh in with one sentence. Don't take too big of the bite of an apple at once. Have a plan, and then start chipping away at that plan, because zero trust is not something that can be implemented in a sprint. It's a strategy that needs to be defined and worked on over a period of time.
That was 3 sentences, but close enough.
No, I couldn't top that one, Brandon. That's absolutely correct. It's a long-term strategy and plan. So you got to break it up into tactical and strategic chunks. So I couldn't say it any better.
And I would say just there is no magic. Think about integration and signals. Signals are key so either you can think about integrating the tools, or you can use one tools or already integrated tools. That's a key part of the zero trust approach, making sure that you get the signals and you can make sense of it.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for your talk, as well as the Q&A panel. I think we're going to have to keep going with this awesome session, because there's a lot more content to fit in a very short amount of remaining time. So the slide deck is back up.
Thank you, Brandon.
Most certainly.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
And if we could advance to the next slide. Almost there. I can see it. All right. In our next section, we're going to hear from Elastic. So take it away, Scott.
Sorry about that. Working on this whole now all of a sudden I'm controlling. So all right, there we go. I figured it out. How hard is it to do this, right? Thanks so much for the introduction. So kick things off really quickly. My name is Scott Holt. I'm a senior solutions architect over at Elastic. So put together a quick presentation today just to give you a little bit of a look into how I was thinking about this. So let me just go ahead and open this up here. There we go. Okay. So, just taking a look, the first thing that I really thought about was the cloud provider distribution. I know this is probably I circled this around internally at Elastic, and a lot of people had similar feedback. And one of the things that I saw was 75% of response had six cloud providers, which just seemed astronomically high compared to what I would expect. Obviously the usual suspects on there: Google Cloud, AWS, Azure, to be expected. But seeing some of those was definitely a surprise for me. I just got off the phone with one of these cloud providers, and I will tell you that they use a lot of the other cloud providers, as you probably would expect. And Azure beating AWS was definitely a big surprise to me as well, because I really see AWS as the 800-pound gorilla in this space, and oftentimes, sometimes to a fault, really. So I think the other real main takeaway that I had, was that multi-cloud is the future, and I think that we've already all known this for a while, but I think a lot of people have been speaking of the 800-pound gorilla, I think a lot of companies that I worked with had really been specialized in AWS and focused on AWS, and they've built a whole business and a whole practice around AWS, to the point that being able to shift or change to other cloud providers has been very difficult for them. But I think this paper brought up a lot of really great points around acquisition, developer preference. I know I prefer GCP over AWS. It's a lot simpler to get a virtual machine or a Kubernetes instance up and running. And resiliency, I think has come up frequently as well. A lot of people sort of had the data center that they'd fall back on previously, but I think that's sort of shifted and that's changed. So being able to resume building and keep everything up and running is definitely a big thing. So I think just plainly, multi-cloud is where everyone is going, and there's no stopping it at this point. So from a big picture overview, Elastic as a SIEM provider, some of the things that stood out to me that were a little bit confusing as well was like third-party SIEMs not being highly leveraged. It's actually really surprising to me. I think there's a lot of different great solutions out there, and this isn't really to say one thing or another. I mean, Azure Sentinel is a fantastic product. I've used it. It's amazing. AWS Detective, Google Chronicle are all strong products as well. But I think from a vendor lock-in perspective, being all in on a specific cloud provider is definitely concerning. So especially to a lot of companies that I work with as well. So I think another thing is if you have a multi-cloud strategy, you're jumping from console to console. If you're using Sentinel and you're using Google Chronicle, and I know a lot of these platforms sort of have cross-platform capabilities. I mean, AWS actually, speaking of which, at reInvent just announced Security Data Lake, which obviously looks amazing. And one of their key differentiators that they're trying to focus on is the fact that you can bring in data from Google or data from Azure as well. So trying to get away from that. But I think really from my perspective, what I'm seeing is a lot of people have 1, 2, or 3 different SIEMs that they actually use. So these numbers were a little bit surprising to me because I'm constantly hearing, I've got Splunk and QRadar, and I've got this, and I've got an old instance of this, and I bought this company and they're running this, similar to the cloud providers, right? So that was definitely something that confused me. And honestly, being able to track shift between query languages and consoles is not something that I wish upon a lot of people. So really, I think one of the other things that I was surprised about is, well, not surprised about, I see this a lot, is sort of this concept of a lift and shift, where you just take this same approach that you've been doing and just apply it broadly. So I mentioned Splunk earlier, so I'll pick on them a little bit again, but essentially what I've seen a lot of the large organizations that I work with doing is, still back porting, still back sending all of their data to a SIEM on premise. So, or a Splunk service that's on premise, and not shifting to sort of more cloud-based SIEM solutions. And that could be for a number of reasons: compliance reasons, ease of use. It's what we've always done type of situations. But a lot of times, and that was something that, this top key component is something that I've seen a lot of. So really, I think that is it's a mistake, candidly. I'm a little bit biased in that situation, but I think that for a lot of customers that I'm working with, they would benefit from going from a cloud native strategy to SIEM-based solutions. And that there's a variety of reasons. It's not just, that it's easier, or there's less initially you have to change things, but it's easier once you actually have it up and running. But I think from a perspective of data costs, right? Actually exporting this data egress is incredibly expensive with cloud providers. They don't want you to send your data off of their cloud solution. So being able to get away from that and being able to actually deploy in a cloud native fashion, AKA being able to deploy, like, for example, Elastic in Google Cloud, in AWS, in Azure, and then sort of a common thing that we do, a common setup we'll configure is multiple clusters deployed in each cloud provider based off of data that you're capturing from that specific cloud provider. So you can have an Elasticsearch service deployed in Google, you can have an Elasticsearch service deployed in Azure, and then you can have a single sort of head service that actually runs the queries deployed wherever you want. So that way your data isn't actually being exported from your specific cloud provider. And that's not to say that we're unique in this matter either. I think you need to find a SIEM solution that gives you the capabilities to do that. So you don't have to pay for this data egress. So you're not sending data back to an on-premise instance. And of course, if you're sort of hands are tied based off of compliance purposes, then I feel sorry for you. But based off of what I'm seeing for a lot of organizations is that if the data that you're capturing from a cloud provider is already in a cloud provider, it's not a big deal. So that's really actually I highlighted a little bit more here, but cloud agnostic security is a must. These are the data egress charges from the different cloud service providers, and really, I think you want to make sure that any cloud logging, security, sinkhole, SIM, whatever you want to call it, is deployed in the specific cloud provider that you're deploying it to. And that's beyond security. That's observability. That's metrics data as well. Any sort of data that you're capturing from here any logging data that you're looking at, you want to have it deployed in a multi-cloud manner if you're deployed in a multi-cloud. So you avoid some of those charges because the small fees do add up, and you don't want to get stuck sending this data back. So really, from our perspective, again, like this is going to be federated queries from a central instance. This is going to be efficient queries sent back to a single cluster, an Elasticsearch cluster that we would configure or we would deploy. But it's really no different if you use another platform. And a lot of platforms have moved. So I mentioned AWS Security Lake, which is a good point. A lot of SIM and sort of search services have moved toward a point where they're almost essentially just a UI layer on top of object store. And Elasticsearch service is no different. So you can layer Elasticsearch on top of S3 objects. You can on top of object stores like S3 or GCS or Azure Blob or wherever you want to. So you have the services that are available, so you can just essentially search across these object stores and store the data for much cheaper. So it's definitely a paradigm shift. And again, with a service that's multi-cloud, you're just sending everything back up to a central service. So you're almost just deploying a UI layer on top of your object store. The other thing that was a little bit, I'd say was something that I was surprised about, candidly, is 30% of respondents felt comfortable giving guidance on using cloud services. And I think that probably was folks who were saying, like, how confident am I? Like, am I 90% confident, 100% confident? Because I'm sure that there's some relative level of confidence that all of us are able to give our users. But these numbers were a little bit lower than I thought. And I think everyone needs to be, if you're not already, I think we're almost on the second generation of cloud security posture management tools at this point, right? We had our, Palo Alto, Twistlock, and we moved on from that to sort of the Wizzes and some of the other companies that are here today as well. We've almost moved to this second generation of cloud security posture management, but tools and Elastic has an offering in this area as well. But tools like this allow you to make informed decisions about what infrastructure choices to make. So, based off of this, these will give you the confidence that you need to actually make these choices, make these decisions, and present these to your user. And oftentimes these solutions will allow you to actually block your users from doing things that they shouldn't do as well. So a lot of times it's not necessarily just being stuck with a remediation report. I spent years at Rapid7. I know what it's like. It's very complicated to patch systems, but moving towards cloud native systems simplifies a lot of that. When you have systems and tools that allow you to simply say, hey, you know what? If your pod's out of compliance, you can't deploy it. So that's the beauty of CSPM products and moving towards this sort of cloud native future is we're getting to a point where, everyone, there's always this gold standard like, hey, auto patching, once auto patching is available, and auto patching was never available. Auto patching was never everything. IBM Big Fix and automation through that, it was never possible at scale. But with Kubernetes, these types of things, this is a real relevant future that we can move towards. And I think one of the things I just want to highlight here with the allotted time that I've got left here was a lot of times the default configurations that are provided through cloud providers are incredibly bad. So I was just running default 1.21 configured cluster in GKE. I don't think I have to tell anybody here, but I just used essentially a one-liner here, a quick little script, and all this did is spin up a pod that had access to the root namespace on the underlying node. So just a simple like container escape demo that we show oftentimes at Elastic. And the thing is, for these types of situations, like you can't rely on the default configurations that are provided from cloud providers. They're just not good. So something like a CSPM platform or product, like similarly to Elastic, this is a cloud posture example that we provide. This will give you an understanding of like CAS benchmarks and understanding of what you need to do, what the remediation capabilities would be, how you actually need to remediate this. Because again, you want to be able to come in here and rely on a platform like Elastic to tell you what's right and what's wrong. And this is a remediation report that I'll give you. It'll tell you the impact, what to do. Pod security policies would block that demo, so it will block you from actually doing it. So it'll tell you to enable PSP on that specific cluster. And just again, I know I'm a little short on time here. So in conclusion, with legacy SIEM doesn't really cut it for cloud native environments. In my personal opinion, cloud providers have native controls, but using them across multiple environments, good luck. And CSPM solutions really are a must for anybody who's deployed in cloud, but especially in multi-cloud environments, because it becomes very, very complex to understand, hey, this is enabled. Particularly, I mean, OpenShift, GCP, AWS, everyone's doing things a little bit differently. So understanding the difference between those different platforms and those different providers, what they have enabled, just let your CSPM do it. Don't worry about it. And of course, we have to be it's up to us. I think one of the things that was really highlighted in this paper is it's really up to the security team to be that guiding light for our teams as they sort of venture into these cloud native environments. So that is an important part, is being confident in the recommendations that we're giving, and these tools do allow us to do exactly that. So yeah, I wanted to stop there and see if there are any questions, or we can leave some of that up for the panel later as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Yes, we will be taking those questions for the Q&A session, but 100%, Scott, I agree with your conclusions. And if there's nothing else that folks take away from this session, it really should be that multi-cloud is here to stay, and it's not slowing down anytime soon. So now we're going to hear from Ulfer from Matiga, and looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you. How do I get control of the slides? Oh, okay. Good. So in perfect timing after Scott's discussion on SIEMs and detection, I will talk about cloud incident response in general, and specifically in multi-cloud environments, which just emphasize the challenge. So thank you all for being here. A few words about myself. I've been doing security most of my career, most of it in AppSec and CloudSec in the recent years. I'm an incident responder these days, because Mitiga is an incident response company. I'm a hacker at heart. Somehow incidents always happen at weekends and nights. So I always say I'm a hacker at day and incident responder at night. In the last 3 years, I've dedicated pretty much everything I do to cloud incident response. I think the pace at which we're moving to the cloud and the pace in which attackers are moving to the cloud is really great. And you know, the pace we're moving is great. Pace attackers are moving is just, you know, following. And we see some recent statistics that almost 50% of incidents now happen in the cloud, and this is just going to increase. And so I'm very passionate about that. So Mitiga, my company, is a cloud incident response company. We started Mitiga in the notion that the cloud doesn't only call for different skills and capabilities, but it's also an opportunity to change the way we do incident response, right? It's historically incident response. I'm talking mostly about large incident response, right? Your data breaches, your ransomware. Historically, it would always be this, I'm calling the services company, and they come in and they bring a bunch of people that start collecting data and figuring out what happened. And this takes a very long process. And we believe that the cloud is an amazing opportunity to do things differently. And it's great because it's also a great challenge because it's more complicated, and it's got so much more technology in it. And especially as people are moving to multi-cloud, the required skills are even greater. And it's just really hard to do it with just human beings and services. And so we built a platform that is combined with people and allows us to do a lot of the forensics gathering, processing, and investigation up front, so that when an incident occurs, sorry, we can respond very quickly. And with that, we went out on our journey, and we've got dozens of customers these days, and we see a lot of incidents. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about those incidents and how they align with some of the statistics that we see coming out of this wonderful SANS survey. So I want to start with identity, and something that came out very, very strongly out of this study, which is weak access enforcement. So everybody in our industry has been preaching for single sign-on, right? Single sign-on, strong identity, MFA. This is what everybody's talking about for the last decade, give or take. And finally, it's happening. There's a broad SSO adoption, although we already see cases where organizations have multiple single sign-on solutions. There's broad single sign-on adoption with supposedly strong authentication with MFA, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And identity is becoming the new perimeter. And I know this phrase is a little bit washed at this point, but it really is that, because everything is dependent on your identity. And once you get through the identity, you can do anything that your permissions allow you. And unfortunately, the permissions allow you to do too much. And so we see in the survey that only 15% implement proper access enforcement through a SASE or CASB. Probably some use something else, so maybe it's a little bit over 15%, but it's not much more. And what we see, and we see that in incident as we investigate them, there's an initial attack vector compromising an identity. Over 50% of attacks now, or incidents, start with an initial compromise of identity. And once they got that, they simply roam through your cloud environments, cloud and SaaS environments, right? And it's amazing how, with this being the largest attack vector, we're still seeing so few organizations even trying to implement proper controls. And I think it's super important to start looking at that. It's also important to improve your identity protection, because what we see is that MFA is no longer a strong authentication method. There have been too many frameworks and too many ways to circumvent MFA. With MFA push, we've seen that, MFA push fatigue, we've seen that in Uber, and adversary in the middle, which we see almost every day. And MFA is just obsolete at this point, or not the concept of MFA, but the way it's implemented with a one-time password or an MFA push. So this is one thing that is really driving incidents in the cloud. The second thing that's really driving incidents in the cloud, and it's really make the multi-cloud environment makes it really worse, is the slow cloud implementation. And I'll try to explain that, because people don't always understand how significant that is. There's a strong push to move forward and put new cloud services out all the time. And the push is on everybody in the organization, right? So it's DevOps and Dev and IT and whoever runs those. And if you look at this survey, how long does it take for an organization to implement cloud services it decided to use? So you decide to do something, and for 2/3, it takes months or longer. And for some of them, that can mean that they do a really great process during those months and do perfect security, and then they put something out. But what we see is that for a lot of them, it just means that it's a very gradual rollout. They put something out and then they improve it. And during that time, we call it the twilight time. It's like in a war zone, it's the time just before the sun rises and visibility is not that great. It's a perfect time to attack. And this is the perfect time to attack on a new service, because when you just started rolling it out, it's probably not perfectly configured. Maybe you ran one pen test before you took it up. Maybe you got a little bit data, sorry, a little bit of security in, but still not perfect, and your team is not an expert on it at this point, and at this time people hit. And as we see that, especially in multi-cloud environment, and we start to build trust between those different services, and we start to build relationship between those services, it's a time that attackers can go after. And so looking at this, looking at the time it takes to implement cloud services is really an opportunity. And I don't think there's an easy solution here, because it does take long to implement cloud services, but it is a place for you to consider how you do enough of the security before rolling out the first part of your gradual rollout. Now, one of the most interesting things in this study, and not surprising, is that incident response is at the last or the least considered cloud service companies are looking at. And it's not because people think incident response is not important. It's because people look at it from a timeline perspective. And, you know, let's first do protection and prevention, right? Let's do the CSPMs. Now let's do some data protection. Maybe let's get a SIM in, right? And Scott's right, we need the right logging, and we need a lot of capabilities that trying to bring them from the on-prem world are very challenging. And then we kind of get to the point where we think about incident response at the end. Unfortunately, we are at our most vulnerable time right now. And so incidents in the cloud not only happen, and they happen a lot, and as I said, almost 50%, you know, some other studies show that almost 50% of attacks now or major data breaches now are in the cloud. But what we also see is that the incidents in the cloud, and especially in multi-cloud environments, are costlier, harder, take longer to detect, and take longer to respond to. And the reason is because we're not mature in the cloud environment, in cloud security, and in cloud incident response as we are in other environments. And incident response maturity is probably one of the most significant areas where organizations can reduce the impact of incidents, right? And again, we see that in studies of cost of data breach, that having a right incident response plan and team will reduce the impact substantially, up to 50%. It doesn't change the likelihood, of course, right? We work on the likelihood part of the risk through detection, prevention, response, but the impact is really influenced by incident response. And incident response in the cloud, is really at its infancy. We look at our competitors, all fairly early stage companies, and it's because it's just emerging. And I think one of the biggest challenges for organizations that are moving, and we hear that from a lot of our customers, as organizations are migrating to the cloud, even large, you know, Fortune 500s that have a big and excellent IR program, is that they don't have the skills to do that in the cloud. And there's not a lot of training or knowledge available to train those people. And at the same time, they're almost impossible to hire people that know how to do cloud incident response. And then even before the fact that there are not that many tools and technologies. And so this is something that so many organizations are not yet dealing with, and should definitely start looking at, because impact's growing. And what we expect to see as numbers are showing up in the last 6 to 12 months, that cloud breaches are becoming more expensive, and multi-cloud breaches are becoming even more expensive, is that the premiums of insurance are going to go higher unless you can show that you can mitigate some of these risks. And this ties also into what Scott says, and it's true for SIMs, and it's true for incident response. Visibility. Visibility in the cloud is probably the biggest challenge right now for security organizations. And some of the statistics here shows that there's not a clear pattern here for people who properly use cloud resources for logging and for security visibility. A lot of organizations still stream a lot of their cloud data into external tools, Splunk and the likes, that were not built for the cloud. And they don't deal that well with the cloud. And the reason they don't deal that well with the cloud is because they're used to a different volume of data. The cloud produces a lot of data, but also just from a pure know-how, they're used to certain formats, right? We know the formats of your EDR, of syslog, of your network logs, but suddenly there's so many new cloud services, right? AWS is fairly easier because a lot of what they produce ends up being in a standard format around CloudTrail. You go to Azure, there are dozens of different log types and log sources, and they all have different structures and different logic behind them on how they're being used. And so you put all that into legacy log technology, and it makes forensics on top of it almost impossible. And as you move to multi-cloud, again, it just becomes harder. So we want to see a move to the modern way, right? Data lakes, Elastic, things like that, that can better address cloud forensics, are suited for cloud forensics. I'm a huge fan of security and forensics data lake. This is what we do at Mitiga. And it's a time for organizations to start thinking about cloud native visibility. We're running out of time, so thank you for listening, and we'll take more questions during the panel.
Excellent. Thank you. And we've got one more speaker before we get into that action-packed QA session. If we can advance the slide.
Yep. I have remote control, I hope. Okay. Ooh. All right. So I'm Ken Perkins. I'm a solutions engineer. I've been with Wiz about almost coming up on 2 years. And we really wanted to talk about today with security in the cloud. All right. And then more pointedly, how to deal with risk. So the agenda, let's talk about 3 things. Why is it hard to reduce risk in the cloud? Why do traditional or legacy solutions fail? And then I'm going to introduce a new term that most of you have probably heard, but if not, I'll always give you a definition of the acronym. In this case, CNAPP is Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. So what's the #1 goal in cloud security? Pretty simple, reduce the risk. And risk could be a variety of domains, which I will definitely talk about in the next 14 minutes or 13 minutes or so. So why is it so hard? Well, our previous speakers talked about literally the multi-cloud challenge that most organizations face. In addition, you also have to choose particular architectures, like if you want to do a traditional lift and shift, or maybe refactor with containers or serverless, or maybe even inherit some of the out-of-the-box solutions, meaning PaaS, so platform as a service. In addition, some of you probably just got back from, I don't want to pick on Amazon, but Amazon reInvent, and they literally introduced dozens of new technologies, times 4 or 5 different types of cloud service providers. And we can see that the scope of technologies grows exponentially, literally every month. Cloud is risky because it's so complex. So previous to the cloud, if you wanted to stand up a LAMP server, you would order your pizza box from Dell or HP. You'd wait a month, you'd rack and stack it, you'd install the different technologies. Along the way, security became part of that particular build process. But now literally anyone with the right permissions can stand up a complete LAMP service in 3 minutes. And unfortunately, we deal with humans. Sometimes they can paint themselves into corners, and unbeknownst to them, they can maybe expose this resource to quad 0 to 4 billion IP addresses. In addition, they are still resources that could have misconfigurations and are susceptible to vulnerability. So if you're playing buzzcard bingo, it could have log4j or spring4shell, or just kidding, OpenSSL. That was a vulnerability that we kind of dodged a bullet the other day. And then unfortunately, there are these notions of resources called secrets and identities, which could lead to this notion of lateral movement in the cloud that once again could be an exposure, an unpatched, and a vulnerability that they have access to these secrets of identity that could up-level their permissions, allow you to move within your environment. And the last thing is it's really tough to operationalize. So our Elastic team just showed us before that there's literally dozens of tools, different technologies and different teams. They're each going to each different dashboards. If you're playing buzzword bingo again, there's really no single pane of glass. You have to go to a lot of different system of records. And in addition, this goal that we're trying to get to, which is DevSecOps, is really tough to get to because there's a security team, there's a dev teams, and there's a variety of other subject matter experts that there's really no single playbook, if you will. Okay. So cloud risk is hard, especially in multi-cloud. Why? Because I'll just build this out and you can read the list here. So alert fatigue, I'll start from the top and we'll go clockwise. There's way too many. So for example, the goal of CNAP, and I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit, is if you do have Log4j or Spring4Shell or OpenSSL on particular resources, but they're not externally exposed, they have the correct level of permission, they're configured perfectly, there's no malware, it's patched, then why should I really spend my time? So we want to get rid of that alert fatigue. No context. Once again, if there's only one domain going off, like it's not patched, or it's not, if it's not patched, there's vulnerabilities, have too high permissions, or it's misconfigured, or it's exposed. The promise of CNAP is give you that context and correlation. CNAP also checks the box that we're going to create a thing called a project. That's one way you could do it, which a project is once over many resources associated once over many teams. Therefore, with maybe like SAML assertion, you can actually descope the work and change the view. So you're only seeing what you're supposed to see. CNAP also—
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Oh gosh, that was my watch, apologies. In addition, with the legacy or traditional vendors, they use agents. Well, we all know that agents aren't super great at doing ephemeral resources or short-lived resources, or maybe even resources that are inactive. CNAP, with the ability to do agentless scanning, checks the box on all of those. Lack of knowledge. This is just general cloud knowledge in itself. So there's still a steep learning curve to get the traditional on-prem vendors and employees up to speed on what truly is the risk in the cloud. It's tough to actually deploy because the deployments are so complex, where you can use different cloud providers. There's no single pane of glass, multiple tools and agents I've already talked about, which just leads to cloud complexity. So the old school way of doing everything on-prem is, it doesn't really lend itself to cloud, meaning agents don't work in Log4Shell. There's no prioritization that if I can show you that I have an exposed DB that has 2 high permissions, they're secret on the disk, and there's actually those databases have PII, PCI, PHI. That's a more concerning defect in the cloud than maybe the traditional way of looking at just an exposed DB. And then in addition, for remediation, we have CNAP actually brings the promise that we can integrate to ITSM technologies like Jira, ServiceNow, or you could even maybe invoke an auto remediation through a Lambda function that actually call a CLI that will fix those things. So it's a different way of looking at security. And CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management, there's another acronym. The unfortunate way that they implemented CSPM in the past is that CSPMs check single rules against a single resource. So the intersection between the real risk and traditional CSPM tools is just a sliver of the true cloud risk. And once again, it's noisy. So for example, if I don't have a database encrypted, or if I don't have firewall rules to expose application endpoint, if there's no other signals going off, and I'll talk about the signals in 2 seconds, then really should I spend my time on that? Okay, so what is the benefit of using a CSPM? What's a highly correlated view of all the domains: external exposure, identity, misconfiguration, vulnerability patching, malware, et cetera, that will actually give you a correlated, indisputable evidence and view that you can actually prioritize the risk. Okay. So I've got about 7.5 minutes. I'm doing pretty good. I probably won't need the rest of it. And at my company, and this is not a company advertiser, we like to say context is king. So if you can correlate all those domains that I talked about before and bubble those up based upon severity, meaning critical, high, medium, low, and based upon the number of findings, that we give you a curated view, once again, with those projects, that you only have to deal with the information that you have to deal with. Okay. And we all know that cloud is fundamentally different. And we're at the epicenter. And I think both previous speakers talked about before. And in fact, there was a statistic before I started, and it had me really excited about the opportunity at my current company, is in 2021, there were more cloud workloads than on-prem. And that only accelerated due to COVID. So I'm making a little bit of joke here, but Wiz was under the fortunate auspices that not only did we start coding during an epidemic, but the adoption of cloud increased 20-fold. Okay. So what are securities? Oh, sorry, what are the biggest challenges in this particular time in history? Well, when you go to cloud, you have to look at all these 8 different domains, which I've talked about before. So you have to make sure that your resource is not exposed. It has the correct level of permission that Elastic talked about before, and the other speaker did too. Change management, perimeter and external exposure. You have to deal with architecture security views. And then we also have this team called vulnerability management. Hopefully the promise of CNAPP can actually give them the ability to focus on the true vulnerabilities that are most risky in your cloud environment. In addition, there's wonderful logging tools out there like GuardDuty and CloudTrail and Azure Logs that if you could actually correlate, and CNAPP brings this to the table, if you can correlate maybe post-breach, it does help out with incident response as well. So what does it mean? Well, it's a holistic way. You have to just wipe the table clean and stop thinking about the legacy way of doing vulnerability management on-prem, also with patching. But it also includes these refactoring opportunities I talked about before, like, do you want to use Kubernetes? Do you want to go microservices like serverless? But you still have the ability with CNAPP to bring in the best of all these worlds, meaning cloud security posture management, agentless cloud workload protection platform, so CWPP, and cloud infrastructure entitlement management. So there's a whole nother domain that we can bring in as it relates to identity. Plus, with DevOps, we do have the ability to CNAPP to shift left, which means during the build process, if you see some or many vulnerabilities or too many critical vulnerabilities or some or many IAC or misconfigurations or too many secrets in the attempted build, you actually can fail that build before the proverbial horse gets out of the barn. And one of the things we really like to say, once again, is agentless seamless scanning, the ability to correlate, meaning with context is king, all those different domains that we're showing on the screen here, and the ability to democratize security, which means we're trying to bring together all the disparate teams. So kind of as a wrap up, what are all the particular domains that CWPP brings to the table? Well, they're listed here. And if there's any questions about which particular domains, I'll go ahead and do a translation. So cloud security posture management, cloud workload protection platform, CMDB, configuration data management. Since you're using an agentless solution, we actually have had customers before that actually use our technology as a system of record because it's up to date and there's no agents involving that'll give you a complete full stack inventory. And then once again, cloud infrastructure entitlement management. Okay. So there is one particular, a little bit of an advertisement we like to do. There's a website called wiz.io/blog, and that'll give you some case studies. So you can take it from a salesperson, because I am a sales solutions engineer, That's one way you can look at it. Or you can take a look at the attestations that we have with 30% of the Fortune 100 that we've earned in the last 20 months. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up. That's my last slide. And then I'd love to go over to the roundtable and we can talk about more. And there's a hyperlink too, if you want to find out what CNAP is. So thanks, Brandon and Alex.
Fantastic. It's really funny how timing works out, because shameless plug here, literally today, the Cloud Ace podcast, which is the SANS cloud security podcast that I host, we launched our last episode of the season, which literally is all about CNAP, CASB, CIEM, CSPM, and CWPP. I mean,
right.
It's like literally the topic we just discussed. So amazing timing.
It is. It's kind of like we're an Israeli company. I like to use the word kismet. Well done.
And to also co-sign another thing that you mentioned in your talk, for better or for worse, COVID has definitely accelerated the adoption of cloud. And I'm glad that folks are here to invest in themselves to help better equip the industry with the tools that they need in this wild new era that we are living in. So with that, let's get right into the QA. I've got a couple of questions for you all, but let's start off by answering some of the questions that we have from our audience. So I know we talked a little bit about this earlier, but Joseph asks, how is cloud incident response different from traditional incident response, especially when dealing with multi-cloud? You want to take that, Ofer?
Sure. So it's a great question, and I get to talk about it almost daily, clearly. So if you look at traditional incidents, before we talk about incident response, traditional incidents, again, there's a variety, but a big part of them involve endpoints, Active Directory, a lot of Windows. And if you look at the average incident responder, they would all be good at Windows forensics. Incident response in on-prem environment assumes that you have ownership of the hardware and software on which the incident took place. And for better and worse, better visibility, you had logs, you didn't have logs, but you can extract whatever you want from those environments and on these technologies. As we move to the cloud and we start doing incident response, we discover two things. One, the incidents are completely different. I mean, there's still stuff going on endpoints in the cloud, but there are a lot of attacks that are cloud native, a lot of SaaS, identity, misconfigurations, a lot of things that are different and requires a different type of expertise to respond to investigate. But maybe the most important thing is we're no longer in control of the data, of the forensics data that we need to do the investigation and on all the things that we need to do to contain and respond. And one of the things we see that while cloud can produce immense amounts of logs, not everybody collects it, and retention in the cloud is very limited. So average retention around 90 days. Some things, we've seen things going 180, but we also see things, some Kubernetes logs being stored for 24 hours and things like that. And what happens is if you just go in and try to investigate an incident, you start going back in time. Again, we're talking about big incidents. They could span over 200 days. You start going back in time, you run out of forensics evidence. And there's nothing you can do at this point, because maybe the forensics evidence lies with AWS or Microsoft 365, but they're not going to give you that. They're not going to let you dig through their hard drives and try to extract data that was deleted. And so different skill set, different challenges, also different opportunities, but it's a really whole new world and it requires changing, our skills, perspective, technologies.
Yep. And a big part of, Ken, did you have something to add? Oh, okay. Saw you were off mute, so I wanted to give you the floor if you wanted to. But on the subject of technologies to deal with things like incident response, we had a large conversation about SIEM. I know that Scott was talking about Elasticsearch in that realm. And one of the questions that I have is, how well do CSP provided SIM as a service offerings support cloud incident response and investigations? And one sub question that I have regarding this is, I know that Elastic in particular has some native integrations with AWS, such as AWS OpenSearch. And it used to be called Elasticsearch, but I think there was a trademark issue. And I actually saw an article recently about this exact thing and how OpenSearch is kind of different than Elasticsearch Cloud. So I'm really fascinated with this topic. So to the original question, how does SIM as a service work in the cloud or not work in the cloud? And what does Elastic offer that is different from AWS's OpenSearch, which I know is based on the same technology?
Yeah, sure. That's a lot to unpack there. So let me just start with the CSP provided SIM stuff. So look, I think at the end of the day, you know, you got to find what provider works for you and all of that. But I think one of the things that's key to this, right? Even if you're using a CSPM provided through SIM, or if you're using a third party CSPM solution, is context is really king for incident response. So you need to get that data into your SIM, right? Or your incident response platform of choice, right? So I'm not really saying anything either way. Like if you're using a SOAR tool or incident response, go that way. But I think the way that I'm seeing a lot of our customers actually leverage Elasticsearch is they have all the data that they need in there, right? They have their proxy logs, they have everything that you think of from a traditional SIM. You mentioned AWS logs, you get your VPC flow logs, your CloudTrail logs, everything else. And then on top of that, maybe agent-directed logs, EDR logs, things like that. And then use cases, if we're thinking about this from a SOC perspective, like use cases like insider threat investigations become a lot more simple when you have all the data aggregated in a single source. So, and that includes your CSPM's data, because if something bad happens in your cloud environment, you understand why that happened, how that happened, and how to make sure it never happens again, right? And that's really what the benefit that CSPM provides to all of that. So I think regardless of whether you're using it through a SIM or a third-party platform, it's really important to have that data in your incident response platform. Now, to talk about your other question, yeah, Elasticsearch and AWS, it's a bit rocky, right? The OpenSearch stuff, but it's all past this now. There was a little bit of a trademark thing. They were using our logo and they maybe shouldn't have, and then they made a license change in open source and how we actually do this in Elasticsearch. But at the end of the day, so OpenSearch actually, we're on version 8.5 of Elasticsearch today. OpenSearch forked, I think it was 7. I don't even remember 6 or something like that, where we actually made the license change. And OpenSearch is now it's entirely a separate entity. The thing is, there's so much Elasticsearch services deployed on AWS, as you can probably imagine, that we're still good friends. So we're still good buddies with AWS. There's no bad things. I think Andy Jassy came out and said something about it as well. So really, it comes down to what flavor you're looking to purchase, right? If you want to buy OpenSearch as a service, you can. If you want to buy Elasticsearch, that's an entirely different service. What I think the key differentiators that are really important to today's discussion in the difference is, they're really focused on being a search platform, and we've dedicated a significant amount of resources directly into our security services. So I came from a company called CMD that was acquired by Elastic, as well as there's Build.Security and Endgame and EDR acquisition we made. Elasticsearch has made a significant investment in security services and actually building a SIM on top of that platform. So whereas OpenSearch is fantastic for some of the different search capabilities like, hey, e-commerce and things like that, I think we've really focused in on the SIM use case.
Excellent. That definitely clears things up a lot. And I can definitely appreciate how you're walking that fine line with them, because obviously you have to partner to some extent with these big players, but also, you have to do what you do best.
Yeah. I mean, every year, millions of dollars of Elasticsearch is deployed on AWS. We're available in their marketplace. We have to work with them. They have to work with us. That's the reality of the business, right? So yeah. They're definitely, we moved past all the trademark stuff at this point, thankfully.
Absolutely. All right, I got another question. What are some of the security challenges posed by lengthy cloud implementation cycles? And I'm going to throw that to Ken, because I know that we talked about how a lot of the energy that we focus on is on cloud configuration management, and dealing with that in a security context can take a lot of time. Now, I personally care a lot about cloud configuration management from a security perspective. And I talk about how in Sec 510, I talk about how that can lead to issues. But like you mentioned, there's a whole lot more to the picture. So how does the implementation cycle affect security? You're on mute.
So we have a mantra at Wiz that says shift left while moving right. So let me break down the right side of that equation. Wiz does an agentless inspection at the bottom of your software development cycle, all the way up to production. So we encourage our customers to connect to dev, QA, test, pre-prod, 1, 2, prod. And then that can identify the most toxic combinations above CSPM. You know, we're not going to get into a religious debate. I'll talk about that in a second. That could actually identify the most glaring defects in your environment. Once again, based upon the domains that we talked about in my slideshow. And we prioritize those risks between numbers and then critical, high, medium, and low. So you can start identifying where those resources come from, which means we also have the ability to shift left. So once again, we have an agentless technology that hooks into Atlanta, Circle CI, GitHub, GitLab, Jenkins, maybe Azure DevOps, that during the build attempt, that you can start baking in IAC and misconfiguration checks or vulnerability checks or secrets checks that will not let, I'll say it again, not let the proverbial horse out of the barn. Now, along the way, we understand that everyone has compliance and OS configuration hardening requirements, which means it's another part of CNAP. We're not forsaking the CSPM or compliance frameworks. And we can also give you a grade that if you do have a GRC or an audit exercise coming up, we can give you the ammunition. Even maybe we even have this thing called a cross compliance heat map, because we know not everyone is 853 or SOC 2 or CIS, but we can give you a holistic grade. But once again, if you marry those two things, then we can help you through your journey to, once again, shift left while moving right.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Cheers.
Now, I have a question. I don't know who to direct it to, so I'm just going to let people go at it. But Ned asks an interesting question of how critical is having cyber insurance as a part of an overall contingency plan when supporting multi-cloud environments? I certainly think that insurance is a good tool in our toolbox, so I'd like to hear what your opinions are of it.
I'll take a stab at it because we work closely with insurance companies as an IR company. So I think insurance is super critical because we all understand that an incident or a major breach is likely to happen. And there's something a little bit odd in that concept, right? Because insurance at its core is supposed to be something that protects us from a very unlikely scenario, right? If you look at house insurance, most people won't experience a fire in their house for their entire lives. The medical insurance is, of course, a different story. And it seems like cyber insurance is slightly moving away from the houses on fire to medical insurance. You are going to be breached. You are going to get through something substantial. And there's a lot of tension around this. We see insurance prices hiking because it is becoming so much more frequent. And we see the deductibles going up because of that. But at the same time, it's almost impossible for an organization today to be without an insurance, because a ransomware or a major breach that can have a 10, 15, 20, $50 million impact, it is a likely scenario. Maybe not very likely, but it is a likely scenario. And so even though we sell IR retainers and part of our pitch is that we reduce the likelihood that you will actually need to activate your insurance, which is good because if you activate it, the price goes up 3 times the year after. But we would still encourage every single one of our customers to have a reasonable insurance.
Makes sense. Anything that Scott or Ken would like to add on the subject?
I might be so bold that if you do embrace the shift shift left while moving right, you might not need as much insurance, but I know that's a bold statement.
Yeah, I'm I'm not going to be that bold. You probably should have it, but don't pay the ransom. But anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Wow,
Maybe-
this is getting fiery.
Maybe just to add on it, I think one of the ways to make your insurance premium go lower and make it more of a doomsday catastrophe is increase your deductibles, right? I'm not going to get anything on, under 5 million, not under the 1 million that's normally where you start claiming your insurance. And that gives the insurance the ability to reduce your premium. I don't know how familiar are you with cyber insurance, but large cyber insurance is built sort of as a tower. There's the primary insurer that takes the first few millions, and that's the most expensive part because even though it's the lowest part, it's the most likely part to be paid. And then a lot of time another insurer will take the next 20 million and so on. So as much as you're willing to take the risk on yourself, and that goes to what Ken says, you can maybe take a little bit on more risk if you do things. You shift left, you add IR, you add other capabilities to reduce your risk, and then you can increase the liability you're taking on yourself and reduce your premium. And I strongly urge companies to look at that because the premiums now on the first millions of dollars are becoming very high, and especially in regulated environments like healthcare and finance, where the lawsuits are becoming very high.
That definitely makes a lot of sense to me, how the premiums could go down with additional protection. I definitely wouldn't want to get rid of the insurance altogether because, as we all know, nothing is 100% secure other than a machine that's been unplugged from the internet, powered off, and destroyed. Those systems are usually not that useful. So, if that were the case, then we wouldn't be here. But certainly, maybe we can reduce the amount that is needed given those circumstances. Okay, so we've got how many minutes left? Math, 12 more minutes left to go. So please keep on adding your questions to the Slack. I'm just going to ask some of the other questions that I have, and I'm going to open up the floor. One of the questions that we have here is that it was mentioned at one point that less than 1/3 of all respondents reported that their incident response security requirements were being addressed by their cloud service provider. How are the remaining 2/3 addressing cloud IR in their environment?
So I guess it's for me to take. So I will say that for a lot of them, it's not. And so when I say it's not, it doesn't mean they have nothing, but it's not really addressed. So most large organizations will have some sort of an IR retainer, traditional IR retainer. It's basically a bank of hours that with some SLA that you set with one of the big consulting firms, right? Amandian and EY, Kroll, one of the big ones usually. And supposedly that covers all your IR needs. So if you have an incident now, you call up the company, they send a team, and they start working. And they do on-prem, they do cloud. Obviously, everybody now gets to do cloud as well. But I will argue, and of course I'm a little biased, but I will argue that this is a really poor way of dealing with IR in the cloud because these services were not designed for the cloud and they don't work at the speed of cloud. They're slow, and that's why we see incident response taking weeks and months sometimes. You send a team over, they don't have the data, they need to start figuring out how to get access to the data. Maybe there's a great elastic there with all the data and somebody gives them the keys. Oftentimes it's not the case, unfortunately, and they spend the first few days just collecting data and getting access, and while everybody's panicking because there's an incident. And what that generates is that in the first 24 to 72 hours, they have almost nothing to show for in terms of forensics and understanding of where they stand. And with the way the industry is changing, with the way regulation is changing, most of the regulations and most of your customer SLAs will require you to do notifications anywhere between 24 and 72 hours. And doing notifications when you don't know what's going on is not a fun experience. And trust me, I've I've held the hand of so many executives doing that or deciding not to meet the window until they have more data. And both of these routes are really, really challenging. And so the reality is that more than half of the organizations don't have a good solution for IR in the cloud. And that's what I said. It's a very troubling statistic to see.
Absolutely. Ken or Scott? All right.
I don't have much to add to that. Yeah, that was good.
Excellent. Another question that you might have more to add on is the survey cited low usage of CSP provided in third-party logs in respondent environments. What challenges does that pose in a critical cloud incident response cycle?
I can take an initial stab at that. The way that we've actually reduced some of the noise there is that we know clouds literally alert on millions of different types of activities. The smart founders and product developers at Wiz actually have taken the most concerning security event logs and correlated those to resources in our environment that will help with incident response and vulnerability assessment, et cetera. So we've actually neutered that particular technology and just created a just bespoke view into the CNAP world.
And I want to add to what Ken said. I think one of the challenges that we see is, and Ken can probably provide more data on that, but the cloud is changing very rapidly. So cloud environments that customers build are very dynamic. Historically, on-prem environments weren't changing that much because you needed servers to change them. But cloud, people create new accounts, new instances, new everything every day. And if you have an incident that started 4 months ago and you start going through log data, and that's great if you have the log data, but the instinct's like, okay, so what's this log? Oh, what's this machine? And then you look at the configuration and look at that machine. But this machine may not exist anymore, or it was a completely different machine 4 months ago. So correlating forensics with history of CSPM. What was the configuration back then? Maybe it wasn't securely configured back then. What is the configuration today? Maybe the attacker did a configuration change. Being able to correlate that and understand how the environment looked back then is super important to getting the right understanding of what happened.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I totally agree with ephemeral infrastructure being really hard to sort of piece that image back together. I think that's, obviously one of the important reasons for logging, to be able to put together that architecture, to be able to put together that view. A lot of times tools like Elastic can kind of restructure what everything looked like 4 months ago or 6 months ago or 12 months ago. What I will say is, just candidly, it's hard. Like, it's really hard. I talk to a lot of companies every day. A lot of them have cloud security posture solutions that are spitting out alerts, telling them to solve this for Log4j or solve that, and they're kind of drowning in some of those alerts. So yeah, it's incredibly hard. I'd say the pros and the cons are such that even though the infrastructure is ephemeral and it's harder, forensics is much harder to do in containerized environments and Kubernetes. The remediation is also kind of simpler. Because a lot of times, I've run into situations where there's a Jenkins server that hasn't been restarted in 2 years. That's just not an issue in Kubernetes. I just kill that pod, right? There's no problem. I kill the pod. That's what it is. That's life. So I think, moving to the whole concept of cattle, not pets. And then I've heard people call them cockroaches, not cattle now, right? Is really important for incident response because the forensics perspective is a lot harder, but responding is a lot easier.
Haven't heard that one before. I've heard cattle, not pets, but not the cockroach one. So that's interesting. It definitely gets even more complex as we talk about serverless technologies. So, those literally can exist for a minute potentially. So that's definitely hard to, yep.
I want to emphasize something that Scott said, because I think that's the beauty of the cloud in a sense. That, forensics is hard, but containment or recovery is so so easy when you got the right infrastructure. You need another machine. Okay, here it is. You need a clean setup. Here it is. It's so much easier building disaster recovery and response plans and things in the cloud. And if you prepare for it right, then you can really reduce how you come back from incidents. And it's saddening to see that despite all of this opportunity, the statistics right now shows that cloud incidents take longer to respond to rather than shorter to respond to, which is where we should be.
Excellent. I know we're wrapping up shortly, and I have about 2 more questions left to ask. Firstly, what are some of the drawbacks associated with the under-adoption of CASB or SASE technologies controlling organizational cloud access as cited in the SANS survey?
So I'll take it. So I think I talked about it a little bit in my presentation. I think our new for the most part, and I've seen different implementation, but our new perimeter is identity. Once we get identity in, everything falls through single sign-on until we get into our cloud environment. And so aside from making our perimeter a little bit stronger, but our compensating control over that is permissions, is managing what users can do. And what we call zero trust in various discussions, and we can go a lot into what zero trust means. But CASB, SASE, and similar zero trust solutions allow us to have a much better control over what users can do because they should do or because they are allowed to do, and most importantly, what they can't do because they're not supposed to. And it doesn't change the fact that their identity might be compromised, but it does change the impact or the blast radius of what happens once this identity is compromised. Especially in a lot of cases, the identity that gets compromised is not a high privilege or an executive type identity. It could be a CSR that, if properly limited, will have a very small impact on the organization.
Excellent. Well, we've got 2 minutes left, and I have one more question to ask. I know that Ken has answered this question in the live chat, but I'd like to open it up to the rest of the floor as well. Brandon Scarborough has a question. First of all, great name. Second of all, they ask, what's your best advice for someone beginning their cloud architecture and security journey?
I mean, just to add to what Ken had answered previously, I completely agree with Ken. First off, the first thing you want to do is build it from the ground up, smart. So you want to have all of your controls in place before you begin that journey, if possible. Some of the things you really want to focus on early on, and these are really not Elastic related, would be like access management. How are people accessing these things? Because I think that's the first component, right? Locking your front door. But then you want to set up things like CSPM, make sure you don't have a hole in your house. You want to set up things like cloud workload protection. You make sure that's like putting up a security camera on your house. So as you start to build up like your cloud house, so to speak, you want to make sure that everything is sort of safe and in place. And so I think that those are to Ken's point, you really want to start out with all those controls in place first.
Yeah, and I want to answer this from a different perspective. I want to answer it from your professional or your personal professional perspective. I think before going into or when starting your cloud security journey, first get a really good, solid understanding of cloud. And I think, I've been in this industry for a long time. I think historically, most security people started with something that's not security, networking, IT, and slowly graduated to security. Now there's so much demand, people go straight away to security, and they often skip the fundamentals. And so even if you're a great technologist, you're moving to cloud security, make sure you go through cloud. Make sure you learn cloud, you understand cloud, build a cloud. It's easy. Just set up a few AWS accounts for yourself and build something, create something, download free images and build something and get a feeling for it, it will make you a much better cloud security architect.
Here, here. And Ken, let's take it home.
No, I answered in the chat. It's never too late to start embracing, like we have a couple customers that actually were all mainframe, and you could probably guess the industry. And what they did was they greenfield their security posture as it relates to moving to the cloud. So they baked in those guardrails, the shifting left while moving right from day one.
Excellent. I think a big part of starting off in your cloud journey and continuing it is attending events like this to hear from cloud security experts and learning more from the professionals out there. So I really want to thank you all for your participation in this panel. And I want to thank everybody for attending today's session. I really appreciate it. Again, I want to thank our sponsors for the day: Cisco, Umbrella, Corelight, Elastic, Infoblox, Lacework, Microsoft, Natiga, Vectra, and Wiz. Thank you so much for supporting this initiative. And I really appreciate everybody who took the time to present today, as well as everybody who checked out the paper or attended today. So with that, I'm going to say, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and happy holidays. And before I forget, as Alec mentioned, is going to mention, I think, again in the Slack, because I think he just sent it to the panelists, make sure to download the associated paper with this session, because there's a whole lot of other information in there that we did not have enough time to cover in this session. So once again, thanks, happy holidays, happy new year, and see you in 23.
Thank you so much, Brandon, Ken, Bob, Todd, Ketter, Ken, Herman, Jack, Scott, Offer, and Ken for your great presentation. And to Cisco Umbrella, Corelight, Elastic, Infoblox, Lacework, Microsoft, Matiga, Vectra, and Wiz for sponsoring this webcast, which helps to bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you. Bye.